Okay, I think I got everything good set up. Alright, hopefully my music is not too loud. Let me know if it is. Okay, maybe on my end it's loud. But yes, we're gonna be reading spooky stories. And I have Grimm here. Would you like to
Hello,
do...
everyone.
Oh, sorry, go
Oh,
ahead.
hello, everyone.
Alright, so yeah, so these are just stories that, like, most of them are ones I've just kind of looked up, or Grimm's looked up, or even suggestions from other people. But yeah, do you want to start reading first?
Yeah, I can go ahead. Um, so I guess we can start off with a classic by H.P. Lovecraft. This is called Cool Air. You ask me to explain why I'm afraid of a draught of cold air, why I shiver more than others upon entering a cold room, and seem nauseated and repelled when the chill of evening creeps through the heat of mild autumn days. There are those who say I respond to cold as others do to a bad odor, and I am the last to deny the impression. What I will do is to relate the most horrible circumstance I ever encountered, and leave it to you to judge whether or not this forms a suitable explanation of my peculiarity. It is a mistake to fancy that horror is associated inextricably with darkness, silence, and solitude. I found it in the glare of mid-afternoon, in the clangor of a metropolis, and in the teeming midst of a shabby and commonplace rooming house, with a prosaic landlady and two stalwart men by my side. In the spring of 1923, I had secured some dreary and unprofitable magazine work in the city of New York, and being unable to pay any substantial rent, began drifting from one cheap boarding house to another in search of a room which might combine the qualities of decent cleanliness, endurable furnishings, and very reasonable price. It soon developed that I had only a choice between different evils, but after a time I came upon a house in West 14th Street, which disgusted me much less than the others I had sampled. The place was a four-story mansion of brownstone, dating apparently from the late 40s, and fitted with woodwork and marble whose stained and sullied splendor argued a descent from high levels of tasteful opulence. In the rooms, large and lofty and decorated with impossible paper and ridiculously ornate stucco cornices, there lingered a depressing mustiness and hint of obscure cookery, but the floors were clean, the linen tolerably regular, and the hot water was not too often cold or turned off, so that I came to regard it as at least a bearable place to hibernate till one might really live again. The landlady, a slatternly, almost bearded Spanish woman named Herrero, did not annoy me with gossip or with criticisms of the late-burning electric light in my third-floor front hall room, and my fellow lodgers were as quiet and uncommunicative as one might desire, being mostly Spaniards a little above the coarsest and crudest grade. Only in the din of streetcars in the thoroughfare below proved a serious annoyance. I had been there about 3 weeks when the first odd incident occurred. One evening at about 8, I heard a spattering on the floor and became suddenly aware that I had been smelling the pungent odor of ammonia for some time. Looking about, I saw that the ceiling was wet and dripping, and soaking apparently proceeding from a corner on the side towards the street. Anxious to stop the matter at its source, I hastened to the basement to tell the landlady, and was assured by her that the trouble would be quickly set right. "Dr. Munoz," she cried as she rushed upstairs ahead of me. "He has his special chemicals. He is too sick for a doctor himself, sicker and sicker all the time, but he will not have no other for help. He is very queer in his sickness. All day he takes funny-smelling baths, and he cannot get excited or warm. All his own housework he do. His little room are full of bottles and machines, and he do not work as doctor. But he was great once. My father in Barcelona heard him, and only just now he fixes an arm of a plumber that gets hurt all of a sudden. He never go out, only on roof, and my boy Esteban, he bring him his foods and laundry and medicines and chemicals. My God, the sal ammoniac that man use for keep himself cool. Mrs. Herrero disappeared up the staircase to the fourth floor, and I returned to my room. The ammonia ceased to drip, and as I cleaned up what spilled and opened the window for air, I heard the landlady's heavy footsteps above me. Dr. Munoz. I had never heard, save for certain sounds as of some gasoline-driven mechanism. Since his step was soft and gentle, I wondered for a moment what the strange affliction of this man might be, and whether his obstinate refusal of outside aid was not the result of a rather baseless eccentricity. There is, I reflected tritely, an infinite deal of pathos in the state of an eminent person who has come down in the world. I might never have known Dr. Munoz had it not been for the heart attack that suddenly seized me one forenoon as I sat writing in my room. Physicians had told me the danger of those spells, and I knew there was no time to be lost. So, remembering what the landlady had said about the invalid's help of an injured workman, I dragged myself upstairs and knocked feebly at the door above mine. My knock was answered in good English by a curious voice some distance to the right, asking my name and business. And these things being stated, there came an opening on the door next to the one I had sought. A rush of cool air greeted me, and though the day was one of the hottest of late June, I shivered as I crossed the threshold into a large apartment whose rich and tasteful decoration surprised me in this nest of squalor and seediness. The folding couch now filled its diurnal role of sofa, and the mahogany furniture, sumptuous hangings, old paintings, and mellow bookshelves all bespoke a gentleman's study rather than a boarding house bedroom. I now saw that the hall above mine, the little room of bottles and machines which Mrs. Herrero had mentioned, was merely the laboratory of the doctor, and that his main living quarters lay in the spacious adjoining room whose convenient alcoves and large continuous bathrooms permitted him to hide all dressers and obtrusive utilitarian devices. Dr. Munoz most certainly was a man of birth, cultivation, and discrimination. The figure before me was short but exquisitely proportioned, and clad in somewhat formal dress of perfect cut and fit. A hybrid face of masterful, though not arrogant, expression was adorned by a short iron-gray full beard, and an old-fashioned pince nez shielded the full dark eyes and surmounted an aquiline nose which gave a Moorish touch to physiognomy otherwise dominantly Salabarian. Thick, well-trimmed hair that argued the punctual calls of a barber was parted gracefully above a high forehead, and the whole picture was one of striking intelligence and superior blood and breeding. Nevertheless, as I saw Dr. Munoz in that blast of cool air, I felt a repugnance which nothing in his aspect could justify. Only his lividly inclined complexion and coldness of touch could have afforded a physical basis for this feeling, and even these things should have been excusable considering the man's known invalidism. It might, too, have been the singular cold that alienated me, for such chilliness was abnormal on so hot a day, and the abnormal always excites aversion, distrust, and fear. But repugnance was soon forgotten in admiration, for the strange physician's extreme skill at once became manifest, despite the ice-coldness and shakiness of the bloodless-looking hands. He clearly understood my needs at a glance, and ministered to them with a master's deftness, the while reassuring me in a finely modulated, though oddly hollow and timbreless voice, that he was the bitterest of sworn enemies to death, and had sunk his fortune and lost all his friends in a lifetime of bizarre experiment devoted to its bafflement and extirpation. Something of the benevolent fanatic seemed to reside in him, and he rambled on almost garrulously as he sounded my chest and mixed a suitable draught of drugs fetched from the smaller laboratory room. Evidently, he found the society of a well-born man a rare novelty in this dingy environment, and was moved to unaccustomed speech as memories of better days surged over him. His voice, if queer, was at least soothing, and I could not even perceive that he breathed as his fluent sentences rolled unvainly out. He sought to distract my mind from my own seizure by speaking of his theories and experiments, and I remember his tactfully consoling me about my weak heart by insisting that will and consciousness are stronger than organic life itself, so that if a bodily frame be but originally healthy and carefully preserved, it might, through a scientific enhancement of these qualities, retain a kind of nervous animation despite the most serious impairments, defects, or even absences in the battery of specific organs. He might, he half-jestingly said, someday teach me to live, or at least to possess some kind of conscious existence, without any heart at all. For his part, he was afflicted with a complication of maladies requiring a very exact regimen, which included constant cold. Any marked rise in temperature might, if prolonged, affect him fatally, and the frigidity of his habitation, some 55 or 56 degrees Fahrenheit, was maintained by an absorption system of ammonia cooling and gasoline engine whose pumps I had often heard in my own room below. Relieved of my seizure in a marvelously short while, I left the shivery place a disciple and devotee of the gifted recluse. After that I paid him frequent over-coded calls, listening while he told of secret researches and almost ghastly results, and trembling a bit when I examined the unconventional and astonishingly ancient volumes of his shelves. I was eventually, I may add, almost cured of my disease for all time by his skillful ministrations. It seemed that he did not scorn the incantations of the medievalists, since he believed these cryptic formulae to contain rare psychological stimuli which may conceivably have singular effects on the substance of the nervous system, from which organic pulsations had fled. I was touched by his account of the aged Dr. Torres of Valencia, who had shared his earlier experiments with him through the great illness of 18 years before, whence his present disorders needed. No sooner had the venerable practitioner saved his colleague than he himself succumbed to the grim enemy he had fought. Perhaps the strain had been too great, for Dr. Munoz made it whisperingly clear, though not in detail, that the methods of healing had been extraordinary, involving scenes and processes not welcome by elderly and conservative Gellans. As the weeks passed, I observed with regret that my new friend was indeed slowly but unmistakably losing ground physically, as Miss Herrero had suggested. The livid aspects of his countenance was intensified, his voice became more hollow and indistinct, his muscular motions were less perfectly coordinated, and his will displayed less resilience and initiative. Of this sad change he seemed by no means unaware, and little by little his expression and conversation both took on a gruesome irony, which restored in me something of the subtle repulsion I had originally felt. He developed strange caprices, acquiring a fondness for exotic spices and Egyptian incense, till his room smelled like the vault of a sepulchred pharaoh in the Valley of Kings. At the same time, his demands for cold air increased, and with my aid he amplified the ammonia piping of his room and modified the pumps and freed of his refrigerating machine till he could keep the temperature as low as 34 degrees or 40 degrees, and finally even 28 degrees. The bathroom and laboratory, of course, being less chilled in order that water might not freeze, and that chemical processes might not be impeded. The tenant adjoining him complained of the icy air and around the connecting door, so I helped him fit heavy hangings to obviate the difficulty. A kind of growing horror, an outer and morbid cast, seemed to possess him. He talked of death incessantly, but laughed hollowly when such things as burial or funeral arrangements were gently suggested. All in all, he became a disconcerting and even gruesome companion, yet in my gratitude for his healing I could not well abandon him to the strangers around him, and was careful to dust his room and attend to his needs each day, muffled in a heavy ulster which I bought especially for this purpose. I likewise did much of his shopping, and gasped in bafflement at some of the chemicals he ordered from druggists and laboratory supply houses. An increasing and unexplained atmosphere of panic seemed to rise around his apartment. The whole house, as I have said, had a musty odor, but the smell of his room was worse, and in spite of all the spices and incense, and the pungent chemicals of the now incessant baths which he insisted on taking unaided, I perceived it must have been connected with his ailment, and shuddered when I reflected on what that ailment might be. Mrs. Herrero crossed herself when she looked at him, and gave him up unreservedly to me, not even letting her son Esteban continue to run errands for him. When I suggested other physicians, the sufferer would fly into as much of a rage as he deemed to dare entertain. He evidently feared the physical effect of violent emotion, yet his will and drifting force waxed rather than waned, and he refused to be confined to his bed. The lassitude of his earlier ill days gave place to return of fiery purpose, so that he seemed about to hurl defiance at the death demon even as the ancient enemy seized him. The pretense of eating, always curiously a formality with him, he virtually abandoned. The mental power alone appeared to keep him from total collapse. He acquired a habit of writing long documents of some sort, which he carefully sealed and filled with injunctions, that I transmit them after his death to certain persons whom he named, for the most part lettered East Indians, but including a once celebrated French physician, now generally thought dead, and about whom the most inconceivable things have been whispered. As it happened, I burned all of these papers undelivered and unopened. His aspect and voice became utterly frightened, and his presence almost unbearable. One September day, an unexpected glimpse of him induced an epileptic fit in a man who had come to repair his electric desk lamp, a fit for which he prescribed effectively, whilst keeping himself well out of sight. That man, oddly enough, had been through the terrors of the Great War without having incurred any fright so thorough. Then, in the middle of October, the horror of horrors came with stupefying suddenness. One night, about 11, the pump of the refrigerating machine broke down, so that within 3 hours the process of ammonia cooling became impossible. Dr. Munoz summoned me by thumping on the floor, and I worked desperately to repair the injury, while my host cursed in a tone whose lifeless, rattled hollowness surpassed description. My amateur efforts, however, proved of no use, and when I had brought a mechanic from a neighboring all-night garage, we learned that nothing could be done till morning, when a new piston would have to be obtained. The moribund hermit's rage and fear, swelling to grotesque proportions, seemed likely to shatter what remained of his failing physique, and once a spasm caused him to clap his hands to his eyes and rush into the bathroom. He groped his way out with face tightly bandaged, and I never saw his eyes again. The frigidity of the apartment was now sensibly diminishing, and at about 5 a.m. the doctor retired to the bathroom, commanding me to keep him supplied with all the ice I could obtain in an all-night drugstore. As I would return from my sometimes discouraging trips and lay my spoils before the closed bathroom door, I could hear a restless splashing within and a thick voice croaking out the order for more, more. At length the warm day broke, and the shops opened one by one. I asked Esteban either to help with ice fetching whilst I obtained the pump piston, or to order the piston while I continued with the ice, but instructed by his mother, he absolutely refused. Finally, I hired a seedy-looking loafer whom I encountered on the corner of 8th Avenue to keep the patient supplied with ice from a little shop where I introduced him, and applied myself diligently to the task of finding a pump piston and engaging workmen competent to install it. The task seemed interminable, and I raged almost as violently as the hermit when I saw the hours slipping by in a breathless, foodless round of vain telephoning, and a hectic quest from place to place, hither and thither, by subway and surface car. About noon I encountered a suitable supply house far downtown, and approximately 1:30 p.m. arrived at my boarding place with the necessary paraphernalia and two sturdy and intelligent mechanics. I had done all I could, and hoped it was time. Black terror, however, had preceded me. The house was in turmoil, and above the chatter of odd voices, I heard a man praying in a deep basso. Fiendish things were in the air, and lodgers told over the beads of their rosary as they caught the odor from beneath the doctor's closed doors. The lounger I had hired, it seems, had fled screaming and mad-eyed not long after his second delivery of ice, perhaps as a result of excessive curiosity. He could not, of course, have locked the door behind him, yet it was now fastened, presumably from the inside. There was no sound within, save a nameless sort of slow, thick dripping. Briefly consulting with Mrs. Herrero and the workmen, despite a fear that gnawed my inmost soul, I advised the breaking down of the door, but the landlady found a way to turn the key from the outside with some wire device. We had previously opened the doors of all the other rooms on that hall and flung all the windows to the very top. Now, noses protected by handkerchiefs, we tremblingly invaded the accursed south room, which blazed with the warmth of sun of early afternoon. A kind of dark, slimy trail led from the open bathroom door to the hall door, and thence to the desk, where a terrible little pool had accumulated. Something was scrawled there in pencil, in an awful blind hand, on a piece of paper hideously smeared, as though by the very claws that traced the hurried last words. Then the trail led to the couch and ended unutterably. What was or what had been, on the couch I dare not say here, but this is what I shiveringly puzzled out on the stickily smeared paper before I drew a match and burned it to a crisp. What I puzzled out in terror as the landlady and two mechanics rushed frantically from the hellish place to babble their incoherent stories to the nearest police station. The nauseous words seemed well nigh incredible in that yellow sunlight, with the clatter of cars and motor trucks ascending clamorously from crowded 14th Street, yet I confess that I believed them. Whether I believe them now, I honestly don't know. There are things about which it is better not to speculate, and all that I can say is that I now hate the smell of ammonia and grow faint at a draught of unusually cool air. The end, ran that noisome scrawl, is here. No more ice. The man looked and ran away, warmer every minute, and the tissues can't last. I fancy you know what I said about the will and the nerves and the preserved body after the organs ceased to work. It was a good theory, but couldn't keep up indefinitely. There was a gradual deterioration I had not foreseen. Dr. Torres knew, but the shock killed him. He couldn't stand what he had to do. He had to get me in a strange dark place when he minded my letter and nursed me back, and the organs never would work again. It had to be done my way. Artificial preservations, for you see, I died that time 18 years ago.
Ugh, that's creepy. Oh crap, my mom's freaking out. Oh jeez, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess I'll go into mine. It's a really short one actually.
If it's short, you could
Yeah.
read a couple.
Yeah, yeah, it's not too long, but okay. So this one is called The Beautiful Face. It was I think it was a prompt, yeah, for a contest. Alright, it's from Vivek, I guess? Okay, let's begin. I snuggled deeper into my bed, clutching my phone. It was raining outside, thunder occasionally rocking the house. The streetlights were little yellow smudges against my wet window. The water drizzling from the heavens had a nice sound. It was all I could do not to drift into dreams. As I was scrolling through my contacts, the aggressive light blaring from my phone lit up my otherwise dark room. Moving boxes cluttered the floor. Tiny snippets of paper stuck to the wall. A small fan hung lifelessly from the ceiling. I could hear my parents talking in the hushed tones in the room next to me. The walls were like paper. I finally found my contact and pressed call. As I waited for her to pick up, old fears crept up. Besides my phone, there was no light in the room because the fan lights don't work and Mom and Dad don't have time to fix it with all the problems around the house. I swear I could hear sounds, apart from my parents and the thunder, and it scared me to no extent. My fears went away when I heard Abby's voice. Bella? Hey Abby, I replied smiling. Abby's voice never failed to make me happy, and so a long conversation struck. We talked about school, family, friends, rumors, etc. I laughed when she told me what happened at the school food fight. Ryan Baker was hit in the face with an apple pie. Well, you should have been there, it was hysterical. It's a shame you moved. We chatted for hours, the storm still raging on outside, but I was in my own cozy little bubble with Abby. It didn't matter. Finally, we ended up talking about my new house. I don't know, Abby, I said hesitantly. There's something strange about this place. I keep on feeling like someone's watching me. I shivered. I'll bet you're just nervous. New house and a new state, it's bound to be a mess at first. You'll get used to it. I sighed in content. Leave it to Abby to make you feel better. I guess, I said hesitantly, but could you stay on the phone to make me feel better? Wimp, she teased. I rolled my eyes, the corner of my lips tugging upward. We talked and talked. Abby, the conversation never ends. Finally, I heard a knock at my door, soft at first, then with urgency. Hold on a sec, come in, I yelled to the door. Nothing happened. "Come in!" I yelled louder. Still nothing. I put the phone on my bed, creeping towards the door, ignoring Abby's questions. I opened the door slowly, but no one was there. I looked down the dark hall, all the doors tightly shut. My heart beating rapidly, I closed my door and hurried towards my bed, picking up the phone with shaking hands. "Bella, what's wrong?" Abby asked. I feverishly explained what happened. I could almost hear her frown. "Well, it could have just been your imagination. Maybe..." Then her voice was gone. I stared at the empty screen and looked outside. The street lamp was off, my window just showing black darkness. I cursed myself, trying to call her back. Nothing happened. I threw my phone on my bed as I got up, exiting my room. I walked down the hall and pressed my ear to my parents' bedroom door. Not a single sound. I felt Abby's voice and my laughs. The house was eerily quiet. I could feel the air buzzing in my ear as I softly walked downstairs, clicking switches as I passed. No light. When I reached the living room, I tried to turn on the TV, but it remained blank. I tried everything in my house that could conduct any light. Nothing happened. Lying in frustration, I sat on the couch and looked outside. It was pitch black, yet there was enough light that I could see around me just fine. The house was so quiet, it was unsettling. The only noise was my quick and deep breathing. I tried to ignore my pounding heart, screaming at me to return to my room. Yet, this was my house. I had no reason to fear it, but the thing was, I did. "I don't think this is a good idea, Paul," my mom said nervously. We just entered the house, the moving people rushing in and out with full and empty boxes. I sat on the floor of the living room looking at my phone, pretending I wasn't paying attention. "Oh, Irene, it's fine. The rumors are rumors for a reason. You have nothing to fear." The rest of their conversation was drowned by the movers' yells and noise. My skin tingled slightly. They never told me any of this. My dad and I sat on the living room couch watching a movie. Suddenly, a scream pierced the air. We both jumped and ran upstairs, barging into my mom's bedroom. She was standing on her bed, pointing her shaking finger at the mirror that hung on the wall across from her. She screamed again. My dad pulled her from the bed, mouthing quiet words. I couldn't hear. My mom replied, her scared voice shaking as tears spilled from her eyes, looking in horror at the mirror. After that, I never went into that room again. A deep scratching sound woke me up. I didn't even realize I was asleep. I got up from the couch, my eyes on the covered window. As I got closer, the scratching got deeper and deeper until it was the only thing I heard. I pulled back the curtain and screamed, jumping away. My heart was pounding furiously, trying to escape the gel formed by ribs. The curtain swayed as a face stared at me, pale, white, blood dripping from the corners of the mouth. The eyes were deep black and stringy hair felt damp from the white skull. Lips matched the skin, and it curled in a sinister smile. I screamed again, running up the stairs, tears running down my face as I ran inside my room and shut the door, flinging myself into my bed and curling into a ball. My head tucked between my legs, rocking back and forth. My mom was telling the truth. I want to leave. Why? I can't. I heard a high chuckle downstairs, and my ball tightened, my heart hurting and blood pounding. I felt lightheaded as if I were to explode any time. I heard that scratching outside my window, and even though I didn't want to, I couldn't resist. I opened the curtain, and that pale face stared back at me, inches from me, rain dripping from its face, only a thin sheet of glass protecting me. Then it opened its mouth, and the world became black. I was in the black hole. It was pulling me deeper and deeper, the air becoming too thick to breathe. I felt empty, devoid of everything. My throat felt tight, like it was choking on something. My eyes were squeezed shut, my lips trembling as the abyss pulled me further and further from what I did not know. All I knew was that I was floating. Beneath my eyes, the face was taunting me, grinning and laughing. My mind felt like mush, my muscles limp. I felt unconscious, but my eyes struggled to open. When they did, what remained of my mind threatened to burst. Instead of seeing black, I was seeing an explosion of colors. Red, orange, blue, purple, all the colors mixed and danced in suspended air. It swirled around me, creating loops and sluggish designs. It was beautiful. Then a great tugging feeling snatched me around my waist. My eyes bulged, the colors fading, a faint scream in my ears, until my eyes could see no more. And that's it, that's the end.
I like it.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Nice and spooky.
I think a lot of it was just a lot of scenes happening, but yeah, it was good.
Yeah,
Alright, you have another one?
I do, but did you want to read another since that was shorter?
Let me see.
I don't mind going again, but the ones that I have are a bit longer, and I didn't want to overpower.
Oh no, it's okay. I don't mind. This one might. Well, I would say this one might be a little bit of a longer one too. So I think you can go first.
Okay. Um. Okay. Next, then, I will be reading Dracula's Guest by Bram Stoker, which is ambiguously related to the novel Dracula. There is
Oh,
speculation that it might have been a scrapped first chapter,
oh,
but it also might not have been. Scholars are still debating about that. Yeah. When we started for our drive, the sun was shining brightly on Moonich, and the air was full of the joyousness of early summer. Just as we were about to depart, Herr Delbruck, the maître d'hôtel of Saisons, where I was staying, came down bareheaded to the carriage, and after wishing me a pleasant drive, said to the coachman, still holding his hand on the handle of the carriage door, "Remember, you are back by nightfall. The sky looks bright, but there is a shiver in the north wind that says there may be a sudden storm. But I am sure that you will not be late." Here he smiled and added, "For you know what night it is." Johann answered with an emphatic, "Na, na, Mynheer," and touching his hat, drove off quickly. When we had cleared the town, I said, signaling for him to stop, "Tell me, Johann, what is tonight?" He crossed himself as he answered laconically, "Walpurgisnacht." Then he took out his watch, a great old-fashioned German silver thing as big as a turnip, and looked at it, with his eyebrows gathered together and a little impatient shrug of his shoulders. I realized that this was his way of respectfully protesting against the unnecessary delay, and sank back in the carriage, merely motioning him to proceed. He started off rapidly, as if to make for the lost time. Every now and then the horses seemed to throw up their heads and sniff the air suspiciously. On such occasions I often looked round in alarm. The road was pretty bleak, for we were traversing a sort of high windswept plateau. As we drove, I saw a road that looked but little used, and which seemed to dip through a little winding valley. It looked so inviting that, even at the risk of offending him, I called Johann to stop, and when he had pulled up, I told him I would like to drive down that road. He made all sorts of excuses, and frequently crossed himself as he spoke. This somewhat piqued my curiosity, so I asked him various questions. He answered fencingly and repeatedly looked at his watch in protest. Finally I said, "Well, Johann, I want to go down this road. I shall not ask you to come unless you like, but tell me why you do not like to go. That is all I ask." For answer he seemed to throw himself off the box, so quickly did he reach the ground. Then he stretched out his hands appealingly to me, and implored me not to go. There was just enough of English mixed in with the German for me to understand the drift of his talk. He seemed always just about to tell me something, the very idea of which evidently frightened him, but each time he pulled himself up, saying, "Walpurgisnacht." I tried to argue with him, but it was difficult to argue with a man when I did not know his language. The advantage certainly rested with him, for although he began to speak in English of a very crude and broken kind, he always got excited and broke into his native tongue, and every time he did so, he looked at his watch. Then the horses became restless and sniffed the air. At this, he grew very pale and looked around in a frightened way. He suddenly jumped forward, took them by the bridles, and led them on some 20 feet. I followed and asked why he had done this. For an answer, he crossed himself, pointed to the spot we had left, and drew his carriage in the direction of the other road, indicating a cross, and said, first in German, then in English, buried him what killed themselves. I remembered the old custom of burying suicides at crossroads. Ah, I see, a suicide. Interesting. But for the life of me, I could not make out why the horses were frightened. Whilst we were talking, we heard a sort of sound between a yelp and a bark. It was far away, but the horses got very restless, and it took Johann all his time to quiet them. He was pale and said, it sounds like a wolf, but yet there are no wolves here now. No? I said, questioning him. Isn't it long since the wolves were so near the city? Long, long, he answered. In the spring and summer, but with the snow the wolves have been here not so long. Whilst he was petting the horses and trying to quiet them, dark clouds drifted rapidly across the sky. The sunshine passed away, and a breath of cold wind seemed to drift over us. It was only a breath, however, the more of a warming than a fact, for the sun came out brightly again. Johann looked under his lifted hand at the horizon and said, the storm of snow, he comes before long. Then he looked at his watch again, and straightway, holding his reins firmly, for the horses were still pawing the ground restlessly and shaking their heads, he climbed to the box as though the time had come for proceeding on our journey. I felt a little obstinate, and did not at once get into the carriage. Tell me, I said, about this place where the road leads, and I pointed down. Again he crossed himself and mumbled a prayer before he answered, it is unholy. What is unholy? I inquired. The village. Then there is a village? No, no. No one lives there in hundreds of years. My curiosity was piqued. But you said there was a village. There was. Where is it now? Whereupon he burst out into a long story in German and English, so mixed up that I could not quite understand exactly what he said. Roughly, I gathered that long ago, hundreds of years, men had died there and been buried in their graves, but sounds were heard under the clay, and when the graves were opened, men and women were found rosy with life and their mouths red with blood, and so in haste to save their lives, aye, and their souls, and here he crossed himself, those who were left fled away to other places, where the living lived and the dead were dead and not something. He was evidently afraid to speak the last words. As he proceeded with his narration, he grew more and more excited. It seemed as if his imagination had got hold of him, and he ended in a perfect paroxysm of his fear-white-faced, perspiring, trembling, and looking round him as if expecting that some dreadful presence would manifest itself there in the bright sunshine on the open plain. Finally, in an agony of desperation, he cried, Walpurgis not! And pointed to the carriage for me to get in. All my English blood rose at this, and standing back I said, you are afraid, Johann, you are afraid. Go home, I shall return alone, and the walk will do me good. The carriage door was open. I took from the seat my oak walking stick, which I always carry on my holiday excursions, and closed the door, pointing back to Munich, and said, go home, Johann. Walpurgisnacht doesn't concern Englishmen. The horses were now more restive than ever, and Johann was trying to hold them in, while excitedly imploring me not to do anything so foolish. I pitied the poor fellow. He was so deeply in earnest, but all the same I could not help laughing. His English was quite gone now. In his anxiety he had forgotten that his only means of making me understand was to talk my language, so he jabbered away in his native German. It began to be a little tedious. After giving the direction home, I turned to go down the road into the valley. With a despairing gesture, Johann turned the horses toward Munich. Oops. 1 second,
Oh,
my
oh,
tab, like,
it just
skipped 2
disappeared?
pages.
Oh no.
Oh, here we are. With a despairing gesture, Johann turned his horses towards Munich. I leaned on my stick and looked after him. He went slowly along the road for a while. Then there came over the crest of the hill a tall man who was also thin. I could see him so much in the distance. When he drew near the horses, they began to jump and kick about, then to scream with terror. Johann could not hold them in. They bolted down the road, running away madly. I watched them out of sight, then looked for the stranger, but I found that he too was gone. With a light heart, I turned down the side road through the deepening valley to which Johann had objected. There was not the slightest reason, that I could see, for his objection, and I dare say I trampled for a couple of hours without thinking of time or distance, and certainly without seeing a person or a house. So far as the place was concerned, it was desolation itself, but I did not notice this particularly till, on turning a bend in the road, I came upon a scattering fringe of wood. Then I recognized that I had been impressed unconsciously by the desolation of the region through which I had passed. I sat down to rest myself and began to look around. It struck me that it was considerably colder than it had been at the commencement of my walk. A sort of sighing sound seemed to be around me now, and then, high overhead, a sort of muffled roar. Looking upwards, I noticed that great thick clouds were drifting rapidly across the sky from north to south at a great height. There were signs of a coming storm in some lofty stratum in the air. I was a little chilly, and, thinking that it was the sitting still after the exercise of walking, I resumed my journey. The ground I passed over was now much more picturesque. There were no striking objects that the eye might single out, but in all there was a charm of beauty. I took little heed of time, and it was only when the deepening twilight forced itself upon me that I began to think of how I should find my way home. The air was cold, and the drifting of clouds high overhead was more marked. They were accompanied by the sort of far-away rushing sound, through which seemed to come at intervals that mysterious cry which the driver had said came from a wolf. For a while I hesitated. I had said I would see the deserted village, so on I went and presently came on a wide stretch of open country, shut in by hills all around. Their sides were covered with trees which spread down the plain, dotting in clumps and gentler slopes and hollows which showed here and there. I followed with my eye the winding of the road and saw that it curved close to one of the densest of these clumps and was lost behind it. As I looked there came a cold shiver in the air, and the snow began to fall. I thought of the miles and miles of bleak country I had passed, and then hurried on to seek shelter in the wood in front. Darker and darker grew the sky, but faster and heavier fell the snow, till the earth before and around me was a glistening white carpet, and further edge of which was lost in misty vagueness. The road was here but crude, and when on the level its boundaries were not so marked as when it passed through the cuttings, and in a little while I found that I may have strayed from it, for I missed underfoot the hard surface, and my feet sank deeper in the grass and moss. Then the wind grew stronger, and blew with ever-increasing force, till I was fain to run before it. The air became icy cold, and in spite of my exercise I began to suffer. The snow was now falling so thickly and whirling around me in such rapid eddies that I could hardly keep my eyes open. Every now and then the heavens were torn asunder by vivid lightning, and in the flashes I could see ahead of me a great mass of trees, chiefly yew and cypress, all heavily coated with snow. I was soon amongst the shelter of trees, and there, in comparative silence, I could hear the rush of wind high overhead. Presently the blackness of the storm had become merged in the darkness of the night. By and by the storm seemed to be passing away. It now only came in fierce puffs or blasts. At such moments the weird sound of the wolf appeared to be echoed by many similar sounds around me. Now and again through the black mass of drifting cloud came a straggling ray of moonlight, which lit up the expanse and showed me that I was at the edge of a dense mass of cypress and yew trees. As the snow had ceased to fall, I walked out from the shelter and began to investigate more closely. It appeared to me that amongst so many old foundations as I had passed, there might be still standing a house in which, through in ruins, I could find some sort of shelter for a while. As I skirted the edge of the edge of the copse, that is a very different word.
It's okay.
As I skirted the edge of the copse, I found that a low wall encircled it, and following this, I was presently uh,
Sorry.
arrived at an opening. Here the cypresses formed an alley leading up to the square mass of some kind of building. Just as I caught sight of this, however, the drifting clouds obscured the moon, and I passed up the path in darkness. The wind must have grown colder, for I felt myself shiver as I walked. But there was hope of shelter, and I groped my way blindly on. I stopped, for there was a sudden stillness. The storm had passed, and perhaps in sympathy with nature's silence, my heart seemed to cease to beat. But this was only momentarily, for suddenly the moonlight broke through the clouds, showing me that I was in a graveyard, and that the square object before me was a great massive tomb of marble, as white as the snow that lay on the ground all around it. With the moonlight there came a fierce sigh of the storm, which appeared to resume its course with long, low howls, as of many dogs or wolves. I was awed and shocked, and felt the cold perceptibly grow upon me until it seemed to grip me by the heart. Then, while the flood of moonlight still fell on the marble tomb, the storm gave further evidence of renewing, as though it were returning on its track. Impelled by some sort of fascination, I approached the sepulchre to see what it was and why such a thing stood alone in such a place. I walked around it and read, over the Doric door in German, Countess Dollingen of Gratz in Styria sought and found death, 1801. On top of the tomb, seemingly driven through the solid marble, for the structure was composed of a few vast blocks of stone, was a great iron spike or stake. Going through the back, I saw, graven in great Russian letters, "The dead travel fast." There was something so weird and uncanny about the whole thing that it gave me a turn and made me feel quite faint. I began to wish for the first time that I had taken Johann's advice. Here a thought struck me, which came under the most mysterious circumstances and with a terrible shock. This was Walpurgis Night. Walpurgis Night was when, according to the belief of millions of people, the devil was abroad, when the graves were open and the dead came forth and walked, when all evil things of earth and air and water held revel. This very place the driver had specifically shunned. This was the depopulated village of centuries ago. This was where the suicide lay, and this was the place where I was alone, unmanned, shivering with cold, in a shroud of snow, with a wild storm gathering again upon me. It took all my philosophy, all the religion I had been taught, all my courage, not to collapse in a paroxysm of fright. And now a perfect tornado burst upon me. The ground shook as though thousands of horses thundered across it, and this time the storm bore on its icy wings, not snow, but great hailstones, which drove with such violence that they might have come from the thongs of Balearic slingers. Hailstones that beat down leaf and branch and made the shelter of the cypresses no more avail than though their stems were standing corn. At the first I had rushed to the nearest tree, but I was soon fain to leave it and seek only spots that seemed to afford refuge. The deep Doric doorway of the marble tomb. There, crouching against the massive bronze door, I gained a certain amount of protection from the beating of the hailstones, for now they only drove against me as they ricocheted from the ground and the side of the marble. As I leaned against the door, it moved slightly and opened inwards. The shelter of even a tomb was welcome in that pitiless tempest, and I was about to enter it, when there came a flash of forked lightning that lit up the whole expanse of the heavens. In the instant, as I am a living man, I saw, as my eyes turned into the darkness of a tomb, a beautiful woman with rounded cheeks and red lips, seemingly sleeping on bier. As the thunder broke overhead, I was grasped as by the hand of a giant and hurled out into the storm. The whole thing was so sudden that, before I could realize the shock, moral as well as physical, I found the hailstones beating me down. At the same time, I had a strange, dominating feeling that I was not alone. I looked towards the tomb. Just then there came another blinding flash, which seemed to strike the iron stake that surmounted the tomb, and to pour through the earth, blasting and crumbling the marble, and as in a burst of flame. The dead woman rose for a moment of agony while she was lapped in the flame, and her bitter scream of pain was drowned by the thunder crash. The last thing I heard was this mingling of dreadful sound, as again I was seized in the giant grasp and dragged away, while the hailstones beat on me, and the air around seemed reverent with the howling of wolves. The last sight that I remembered was a vague white moving mass, as if all the graves around me had sent out the phantoms of their sheeted dead, and that they were closing in on me through the white cloudiness of driving hail. Gradually, there came a sense of vague beginning of consciousness. Then, a sense of weariness. That was dreadful. For a time I remembered nothing, but slowly my senses returned. My feet seemed positively racked with pain, Yet I could not move them. They seemed to be numbed. There was an icy feeling at the back of my neck and all down my spine and my ears, like my feet were dead yet in torment. But there was in my breast a sense of warmth, which was by comparison delicious. It was as a nightmare, a physical nightmare, if only may use such an expression, for some heavy weight on my chest made it difficult for me to breathe. This period of semi-lethargy seemed to remain a long time. As it faded away, I must have slept or swooned. Then came a sort of loathing, like the first stage of seasickness, and a wild desire to be free of something, I knew not what. A vast stillness enveloped me, as though all the world were asleep or dead, only broken by the low panting of some animal close to me. I felt a warm rasping at my throat. Then came a consciousness of the awful truth which chilled me to the heart and sent the blood surging through my brain. Some great animal was lying on me and now licking my throat. I feared to stir, for some instinct of prudence bade me lie still, but the brute seemed to realize that there was now some change in me, for it raised its head. Through my eyelashes I saw above me two great flaming eyes of a gigantic wolf. Its sharp white teeth gleamed in the gaping red mouth, and I could feel its hot breath fierce and acrid upon me. For another spell of time I remembered no more. Then I became conscious of a low growl, followed by a yelp, renewed again and again. Then, seemingly very far away, I heard a "Holler! Holler!" as of many voices calling in unison. Cautiously I raised my head and looked in the direction whence the sound came, but the cemetery blocked my view. The wolf still continued to yelp in a strange way, and a red glare began to move around the ground of cypresses, as though following the sound. As the voices drew closer, the wolf yelped faster and louder. I feared to make either sound or motion. Nearer came the red glow over the white pall which stretched into the darkness around me. Then, all at once, from behind the trees, there came a trot of troop of horsemen bearing torches. The wolf rose from my breast and made for the cemetery. I saw one of the horsemen, soldiers by their caps and their long military cloaks, raise his carbine and take aim. A companion knocked up his arm, and I heard the ball whiz over my head. He had evidently taken my body for that of the wolf. Another sighted the animal as it slunk away, and a shot followed, then a gallop. The troop rode forward some towards me, others following the wolf as it disappeared amongst the snow-clad cypresses. As they drew nearer, I tried to move, but was powerless, although I could see and hear all that went on around me. Two or three of the soldiers jumped from their horses and knelt beside me. One of them raised my head and placed his hand over my heart. "Good news, comrades," he cried. "His heart still beats." Then some brandy was poured down my throat. It put vigor into me, and I was able to open my eyes fully and look around. Lights and shadows were moving among the trees. I heard men call to one another. They drew together, uttering frightened exclamations, and the lights flashed as the others came pouring out of the cemetery, pell-mell, like men possessed. When the further ones came close to us, um, those who were around me asked them eagerly, "Well, have you found him?" The reply rang out hurriedly, "No, no, come quick, quick, this is no place to stay, and on this night of all nights." "What was it?" was the answer, asked in all manner of keys. The answer came variously and indefinitely, as though the men were moved by some common impulse to speak, yet were restrained by some common fear for giving their thoughts. It, indeed," gibbered one, whose wits had plainly given out for a moment. "A wolf, and yet not a wolf," another put in shudderingly. "No use for trying for him without the sacred bullet," a third remarked, in a more ordinary manner. "Serve us right for coming out on this night. Truly we have earned our 1,000 marks," were the ejaculations of the fourth. "There was blood on the broken marble," another said after a pause. "The lightning never brought that there. And for him, is he safe? Look at his throat. See, comrades, the wolf has been lying on him and keeping his blood warm." The officer looked at my throat and replied, "He is all right. The skin is not pierced." "What does it all mean? We should never have found him but for the yelping of the wolf." "What became of it?" asked the man who was holding up my head and who seemed the least panic-stricken of the party, for his hands were steady and without tremor. On his sleeve was the chevron of a petty officer. "It went home," answered the man, whose long face was pallid and who actually shook with terror as he glanced around him fearfully. There are graves enough there in which it may lie. Come, comrades, come quickly, let us leave this cursed spot. The officer raised me to a sitting posture as he uttered a word of command. Then several men placed me upon a horse. He sprang to the saddle behind me, took me in his arms, and gave me the word to advance, and, turning our faces away from the cypresses, we rode away in a swift military order. As my tongue refused its office, I was perforce silent. I must have fallen asleep, for the next thing I remembered was finding myself standing up, supported by a soldier on each side of me. It was almost broad daylight, and to the north a red streak of sunlight was reflected like a path of blood over the waste of snow. The officer was telling the men to say nothing of what they had seen, except that they found an English stranger guarded by a large dog. Dog. That was no dog, cut in a man who had exhibited such fear. I think I know a wolf when I see one. The young officer answered calmly. I said a dog. Dog, reiterated the other ironically. It was evident that his courage was rising with the sun, and pointing to me, he said, Look at his throat. Is that the work of a dog, master? Instinctively, I raised my hand to my throat, and as I touched it, I cried out in pain. The men crowded round to look, some stooping down from their saddles, and again there came the calm voice of the young officer. A dog, as I said. If aught else were said, we should only be laughed at. I was then mounted behind a trooper, and we rode on into the suburbs of Munich. Here we came across a stray carriage into which I was lifted, and it was driven out to my hotel. The young officer accompanying me, whilst a trooper followed with his horse, and the others rode off to their barracks. When we arrived, Herr Delbruck rushed so quickly down the steps to meet me that it was apparent he had been watching within. Taking me by both his hands, he solicitously led me inside. The officer saluted me and was turning to withdraw, when I recognized his purpose and insisted that he should come to my rooms. Over a glass of wine, I warmly thanked him and his brave comrades for saving me. He replied simply that he was more than glad, and that Herr Delbruck was the first had the first taken steps to make all the searching party pleased, at which ambiguous utterance the mater smiled, while the officer pleaded duty and withdrew. But Herr Delbruck, I inquired, how and why was it that the soldier searched for me? He shrugged his shoulders as if in depreciation of his own deed, as he replied, I was so fortunate as to obtain leave from the commander of the regiment in which I was asked to serve, to ask for volunteers. But how did you know I was lost? I asked. The driver came hither with the remains of his carriage, which had been upset when the horses ran away. But surely you would not send a search party of soldiers merely on this account. Oh no, he answered, but even before the coachman arrived, I had this telegram from the boyar whose guest you are. And he took from his pocket a telegram which he handed to me, and I read, The streets. Be careful of my guest. His safety is most precious to me. Should aught happen to him, or if he be missed, spare nothing to find him and ensure his safety. He is English and therefore adventurous. There are often dangers from snow and wolves at night. Lose not a moment if you suspect harm to him. I answer your zeal with my fortune. Dracula. As I held the telegram in my hand, the room seemed to whirl around me, and if the attendant mater had not caught me, I think I should have fallen. There was something so strange in all of this, something so weird and impossible to imagine, that there grew on me a sense of my being, in some way, the sport of opposite forces, the mere vague idea of which seemed, in a way, to paralyze me. I was certainly under some form of mysterious protection. From a distant country had come, in the very nick of time, a message that took me out of the danger of the snow sleep and the jaws of the wolf. Yeah.
Ooh, that's yeah. Okay. So I'll go on to the next one. This one I hope it's not. It doesn't seem too long, but it is a creepypasta. And it's called The Last Bus. Written by, I like the name of the art. I mean the writer, Woundlicker. Interesting. Alright, let's begin. Sorry, hold on, I had to be. Okay, yeah, sorry about that. I know. I think my mom was like yelling for my dog. I know, it's okay. Yeah, I could just hear. I'm sorry if you heard her. Okay, alright. So let's start. Um, the first time I caught the night bus was pure chance. I'd heard the legends, of course. We all had. Urban legends are a big thing where I live. I suspect it's partly because I hail from an unremarkable and frankly dull provincial city that has little else going for it. Kids growing up around here don't have much to do, and so their imaginations tend to run wild, with escapism being all the rage. My friends and I were obsessed with urban legends during our formative years, gobbling up the tales whispered in the playgrounds, and later posted by anonymous posters on online forums. We found legends both frightening and exaggerate. I can't even say the word. Oh crap. Anyways, bringing excitement to our otherwise boring lives. It'd be fair to say that I was quite naive back then. Some of my friends were more cynical, but I truly believed them all. Vanishing Hitchhiker or Spencer Street, the South Side Trollman, and the White Lady of Croft Manor were a few of my favorites. My friends and I took on the role of amateur sleuths, investigating every site and searching for any evidence of these legendary cryptids and otherworldly entities. To my extreme disappointment, we found nothing. No ghosts, no ghouls, no monsters, and no signs of anything out of the ordinary. Eventually, I too became cynical, concluding that all such legends were just childish nonsense, and I was wasting my time pursuing them. The last bus was another of the local myths that we'd heard of growing up, and I'd assumed it was bullshit like the others, but now I know better. Officially, the last bus out of the city center leaves at 1:45 from the bus depot on High Street. That's the bus which sensible people catch if they want to get home safely after a night out on town. The pubs and clubs close at 1 a.m., and the crowds of drunken revelers pile onto the streets, fighting over taxis, queuing up for late-night kebabs, attempting a last-minute hookup, or calling up friends in search of all-night house parties. It's the same chaotic scene every Friday and Saturday night. Usually there are a couple of punch-ups and a few people who will injure themselves by falling over drunk on the pavement. It's all depressingly predictable. The police would be called out, as well as the ambulance crews, and eventually the crowds would disperse as an eerie silence returns to the darkened streets. Then we enter the twilight hours, when all sensible and law-abiding citizens are at home, safely tucked up in their beds. After hours, the streets are left to the vulnerable, like the homeless with nowhere else to go, forced to seek shelter in shop floor fronts, wrapping their cold bodies in the old sleeping bags and praying that they make it through the night. And then there are the predators, the ones that your mother warned you about, the gangs of thugs who patrol the streets, their blood up as they search for a victim to violently attack, and the predatory men who lurk in the shadows, watching for vulnerable women who they can prey upon. On a Monday morning, you'll read the stories in the local newspapers: a homeless man beaten to a pulp, a young girl sexually assaulted in a back alley. Police will open investigations and appeal for witnesses. Sometimes they'll catch the perpetrators, other times they won't. You have sympathy for the victims, but secretly few believe that it didn't happen to you or somebody you know. But in these cases, the culprits are human monsters, made of flesh and bone, and not the otherworldly fiends I tend to chase. During my cynical years, I believed these human predators were the worst thing out there, that they owned the twilight hours before the dawn. But I was wrong, and now I know the truth. There are a few worse things that lurk in the shadows. The first occasion I caught the night bus came during a difficult time for me. I just turned 21 and had split up with my partner of 2 years. Looking back, I now see how the breakup was the best thing for both of us, but at the time I was devastated and so angry. My friends had taken me for a night out on the town in the hope it would cheer me up. A nice idea, but unfortunately it didn't work out that way. I drank way too much, starting on the beers, and moving on to shots of hard liquor. We went to a club where I made several embarrassing and unsuccessful attempts to hook up. As if that wasn't bad enough, I then started a fight with my best friend, throwing a punch at him before I got thrown out of the club by the doorman, and foolishly decided to walk the streets alone in a drunken stupor. Somehow, I managed to avoid getting beaten up or falling on my face, and cracking my head open on the pavement. Instead, I managed to stagger to a bus shelter, not realizing in my state that the official bus service had finished for the night, and there wouldn't be another one due until morning. I remember lying down to rest on the bench, and I must have passed out because I woke up several hours later and saw the streets were empty. I was all alone, or so I thought. My heart almost jumped out of my chest when I saw the old bus driving down the street towards me, emitting black smoke from its exhaust pipe as it came, its noisy engine interrupting my previous quiet. The vehicle was partially illuminated by the streetlights, although I noted with some concern how the lamps flickered as the bus drove by them. The vehicle looked like a throwback from the 1960s, the kind of ancient tin can on wheels you'd expect to see at a classic car show. Unlike the modern vehicles we're used to, those that glide along the street quietly, this old rust bucket rattled along, noisily, looking as if it could break down any moment. But instead it kept coming, driving down the empty road and coming ever closer to my shelter. I noted how there were no emblems or motifs painted on the side of the bus, and no destination name was shown above its front windscreen. The vehicle's exterior was painted all in black, and even the windows were tinted, meaning I could not see who or what was inside. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I recalled the details I'd heard about the last bus legend, one of those I'd read and studied during my youth. The vehicle I was seeing before me matched the description of the coach in the story. The phantom bus that appears on an abandoned street in the early hours, offering lifts to the weary and needy. I came close to a panic in that moment, wondering whether I was dreaming or suffering from a paranoid delusion. I spent so much of my youth chasing these legends, searching for any evidence that could prove the existence of something outside of our own reality. But now that the truth was staring me in the face, a big part of me wanted to up sticks and run. But I didn't. I don't know whether I was frozen to the spot with fear or if my curiosity got the better of me. But I held my ground and waited for the bus to come to me. I stood up on my shaking feet as the coach pulled in beside my shelter, and despite the amount of alcohol I'd consumed, I suddenly felt quite sober. It seemed to take forever for the vehicle to park up and for the creaking old door to swing open. When it did, I was confronted by a friendly middle-aged man wearing a neat blue uniform while he sat behind the wheel, driving his bus to an unspecified location. He smiled down at me, his eyes twinkling in a amicable and welcoming fashion. Then he opened his mouth and spoke in a soft, almost fatherly tone of voice, saying, "Good evening, my friend. Are you coming on board?" I'd heard about the enigmatic driver before, but nevertheless, his appearance and whole demeanor took me off guard. I started to find the words to respond, stuttering my way through my reply. "Where will you take me?" I inquired nervously. "Home," the driver responded with a reassuring smile. "I'll take you home, eventually. But life isn't about the destination, it's about the journey. Sometimes you need to take a leap of faith. So, what do you say, my young friend? Will you ride with us?" I admit to being scared in that moment, terrified in fact. Somehow I realized how important this was, how the decision I made right then would shape the rest of my life. I didn't know what exactly would await me if I got on board, but I had a good idea, and it was terrifying. But if I walked away, I would never discover the truth. And so I took a deep breath, plucked up my courage, and stepped onto the bus, seeing the driver smile as the door shut firmly behind me. When I saw the bus driver up close, I sensed something sinister about him and instantly started regretting my decision, but by then it was too late. That was the first time I rode the night bus. Over the years, I'd been on it 3 times in total, living to tell my tale in each occasion. Catching the phantom bus isn't as easy as you would imagine. There's no set of rules that you can follow. and no set time or location. I don't know whether it's pure chance or if the bus itself chooses its passengers. I have, however, been able to piece together common threads using both my own experiences and those of others who have made the journey. We have an online forum which we use to tell our stories and exchange information. It's an issue of safety as much as anything else. The night bus can be lethal if you don't keep your wits about you. Having accumulated this knowledge over the last number of years, I will now share it with you here. Once you step on board the bus, you'll see rows of hard-backed seats stretching back to the rear of the vehicle's interior. There's nothing unusual about this, at least not at first glance. You'll see other passengers too, but you mustn't engage with them at this point, and don't look them in the eye. Take a seat on an empty bench somewhere towards the front of the bus. Doesn't really matter where exactly. They will come to you in their own time. The journey itself can last for hours, or at least that's what it will seem like when you're on board. You can see out the windows from the inside and look upon the scenery, such as it is. Initially, you will see familiar sights, city, center streets, buildings, and businesses that you'll recognize. Nevertheless, you'll soon realize that something isn't quite right with the scene. The streets will be totally abandoned, with no traffic or pedestrians anywhere to be seen. There won't be any businesses open or lights in a minute. I can't even say the words. Just lights from anywhere along the road. But the further you drive off from the city center, the more bizarre the sights you will encounter. Soon, the tidy streets and well-maintained buildings will give way to urban decay, crumbling structures and ruins like those of a lost city forgotten by time. Eventually, the bus will leave the city behind and enter what appears to be a dense forest. The narrow road you will follow will be shrouded in darkness, the only illumination coming from the vehicle's bright headlights. If you glance into the woods on either side of the road, you will occasionally catch a glimpse of shadows moving behind the tree line, strange figures and unidentified animals with glowing red eyes glaring through the darkness. You'll see these unnerving creatures for only the briefest of seconds as the bus drives through, and then they'll be gone. At first you think it's just your imagination playing tricks on you, but deep down you know that there is something evil lurking in those woods. By this point in the journey, it should become clear that you're no longer in the realm of the living. I don't know where the bus takes you, but I do know it's not wise to stare out the windows for too long. What lurks out there can drive you mad, and besides, your focus should be on those inside the bus, as they pose the more immediate threat. My fellow online sleuths and I think of the passengers as lost souls. It seems certain that they are no longer part of the world of the living. There's something lacking in them, an important piece that is missing. Once you talk to them, and they will engage with you, whether you want them to or not, you'll see the sadness in their empty dead eyes. They want to latch onto you because you have what they want, life. That's why it's so important that you follow the rules. Don't let them get inside of your head, whatever you do. There are 6 entities you're likely to encounter once you set foot upon the bus, all of whom have their own unique traits, and tricks which they'll attempt to use against you. Based on the shared experiences of our 4 members, I have pieced together a description of each one of these otherworldly entities. Firstly, there's the driver, whose physical description I've already covered. The driver's first job is to get you on board. That's why he appeared to be so friendly and welcoming, enticing you to take a ride on his bus. However, once the door shuts behind you and the bus starts moving, you'll see the driver's smile falter ever so slightly as he breaks eye contact and focuses on the road. Despite this, the driver is a benign figure who plays a small but important role in the events which follow. His job, from this point onward, is simply to drive, and he does keep his promise to you. He will bring you home eventually, assuming you don't fall foul of any of the spirits during the drive. Like I said, the journey will seem to last for hours, but when he drops you off on your home street, back in our realm, no time will have passed whatsoever. He lets you off, smiling once again and saying, "Have a nice evening, hope to see you again soon." And you'll be left standing on the pavement outside of your home, bewildered and still in a state of shocked disbelief as you watch the phantom bus drive down the road before it inexplicably vanishes at the end of your street. After the driver, the first passenger you're likely to notice is the party girl. This is an attractive young woman who appears to be in her early to mid-20s. Her physical appearance will change on each occasion. Sometimes her hair will be brunette, and other times blonde. Likewise, her skin complexion can either be pale or dark, depending upon the beholder. What's consistent is how she's made up and dressed. Donning a cocktail dress and high heels and carrying a designer handbag. Her fragrance is sweet and enticing, but you may also smell a hint of alcohol on her breath. You'll note how her mascara has run, indicating that she has been crying. Nevertheless, there's something in her deep and expressive eyes which will draw you in. An inner beauty and vulnerability that plays on your emotions. It's worth noting that you'll be attracted to a young woman in spite of your gender or usual preferences. You'll be unable to take your eyes off her and will feel compelled to take a seat close to her. The party girl will engage with you during the early stages of the journey, distracting you from the bizarre sights outside of the bus's window. At first, she'll be flirtatious and fun, asking you about yourself and talking about her night out, but soon the conversation will take on a darker tone, as the girl tells you about the tragic events from her past. Childhood abuse, violent ex-partner, or the death of a loved one. The story will vary each time, but will always be one of sadness and suffering. Your heart will go out to her, even if you're not usually an empathetic person. Once she's told you her woeful tale, the young woman will ask you to go home with her, to give her some comfort. You would be tempted, but under no circumstances should you agree to go with her. It's critical that you remember what she is and what she really wants from you. My advice is just to politely decline her offer without causing her undue suffering. The party girl may be a lost soul, but by all accounts, she still feels human emotions. She won't be angry when you reject her, but instead will sob softly into her hands. You feel guilty, but you must move on and switch seats, leaving the poor girl to her misery. The next passenger encounter sits a couple of rows behind the party girl. We call her the OAP, or the pensioner? I have no idea how to say it. She's an elderly woman, probably in her 80s. Her white hair in curls, wearing a shawl and a heavy winter coat, and with a shopping cart and wheels parked underneath her seat. Her face is wrinkled, and the perfume she wears is quite overbearing, but the OAP has kind eyes and a sweet motherly smile. She'll remind you of an elderly relative, like a grandmother or great aunt, and you will feel an affection towards her. A woman of her age and appearance is the last person you'd expect to find riding a night bus during the early hours of the morning. And yet here she is, another lost soul trapped on a journey that never ends. The OAP will speak with you in a kindly, wholesome fashion, asking about your life and your family, while also entertaining you with anecdotes from her long and interesting life. You truly will feel at ease talking with her, but you mustn't forget what she really is. The conversation will end with the woman asking you to come to her home to help with her shopping, or something like that. She'll offer to prepare you something to eat, your favorite meal or snack, whatever that may be, and she'll offer to put you up for the night. Again, you'll be tempted, but you must say no. On this occasion, it doesn't actually matter how politely you refuse her offer. Whatever you say or do, she will react with absolute fury, screaming every obscenity under the sun as her face screws up with anger. It's the last thing you would expect from a seemingly sweet old lady, but this is what will happen. As soon as she launches into her hateful tirade, you should leave your seat and move further down the bus, and you'd be wise not to engage with her again for the rest of your journey. The next passenger you meet is a scruffy middle-aged man known as the drunkard. He sits close to the back of the bus and is perhaps the type you would expect to find on a late-night service. I wouldn't recommend sitting too close to the drunkard, if only because he smells pretty bad, his breath stinking of alcohol and cigarettes. You'll note how his old clothes are soiled and torn, and his unkempt beard would be badly matted. You probably won't wish to engage with him, but the drinker will begin the conversation with you regardless, and against your better judgment, you'll get drawn in. The drinker would turn out to be surprisingly intelligent and insightful, seeking to educate you on such matters as religion, philosophy, and scientific theory. He'll tell you a story in the form of a parable, or fable, one with a dark twist to it. When I first met the drunk, he recounted to me the tale of the frog and the scorpion, one that demonstrates the cruel and destructive nature of life. Next, he'll remove a silver hip flask from his inside jacket pocket and offer you a drink. Regardless of your alcoholic preference, you'll be tempted to take a sip. The drink will smell so sweet and inviting, but of course you must refuse him. After you turn on the drink, the drunkard will shoot you an angry look before shaking his head and saying, "You're a damn fool, a stupid little child. You have no idea what you're dealing with." This is your cue to move on. Now, you notice how the first three passengers are trying to draw you in, using whatever charms or supernatural powers they have at their disposal. Their ultimate goal is to trick you into leaving the bus. Nevertheless, needless to say, you must not do this, not if you want to make it home. Nobody knows what exactly happens to those who fall into one of their traps. We do know that several members of our forum have vanished without a trace over the years, and my city has a long history of unexplained disappearances. The fourth passenger is different from the rest, however. He is a young man who sits on the back row, whilst listening to headphones linked up to an 80s style Walkman. We call him Headphones Guy, and it seems all he does is listen to music. His eyes close as he taps his foot to the beat. The Headphones Guy will not attempt to engage with you or even acknowledge your presence. That's not to say he isn't dangerous, however. There was a member of our group who had run-in with the guy. To be fair, it wasn't unprovoked. Feeling bold, my friend got up right in the passenger's face, waving his hands and clicking his fingers in an attempt to gain the spirit's attention. When this failed, he foolishly grabbed the guy's headphones, physically pulling them off his head. Predictably, Headphones Guy didn't react well to this violation. In an instant, he jumped up from his chair, lashing out with his fist, and knocking his assailant down with one punch. My friend remembers a sharp, intense pain in the back of his head before he blacked out. The next thing he remembers is waking up in his own bed the next morning with a broken nose and a nasty gash on the back of his head. He also found a note in his jeans pocket, crudely written on the back of an old bus ticket in what looked like dried blood, and it read, "Do that again and I'll rip your, I won't say that, effing head off." Unsurprisingly, my friend never rode the knife bus again. I don't know what the Headphones Guy's deal is, but my advice is to leave him well alone. So at this point, you're probably wondering why one would want to wish to catch the night bus at all, given how you'll be transported to a terrifying alternative reality and encounter otherworldly spirits who wish to trap you there. Well, the short answer is that no sane person would, bar a handful of crazed urban adventurers and amateur paranormal investigators such as myself. Most of those who boarded the Phantom coach have done so by accident, not realizing what they were getting themselves into until it's too late. And most of those who ride the bus once have no inclination to do so again. But those of us who do seek out the Phantom coach for a second, third, or in my case, fourth occasion, well, we have our reasons. One reason above all others, in fact. We want to see the Harbinger. Harbinger? Yeah. And ask him our one permitted question. I'll regret my first ride on the bus for the rest of my days. Although I was drunk, I had enough wits about me to see off the various tricks used by the ghouls, but I wasn't prepared for him. The Harbinger is the only passenger who isn't already riding on the bus when you first get on. He comes later, after you've negotiated your way through the ghostly entities and you think the worst is behind you. The first thing you notice is the burning cross mounted on top of the darkened hillside, overlooking the road on the left-hand side. I remember the first time I saw that foreboding symbol and the immense fear I felt, as I knew something bad was coming. A moment after I spotted the cross, I was shocked to see the bus was slowing down, pulling over to the other side of the road and parking up in a lay-by. Next, the driver operated the swing door at the front of the bus, opening it to whatever lay on the other side. The terror almost overwhelmed me as I thought of the horrors that lurked within the Shadowlands, of the creatures and demons hiding in the haunted woods and hillsides. I recall looking to the other passengers, somehow hoping these devious spirits would offer me some protection from whatever was coming, but instead their heads were down, as they all maintained a solemn silence. Realizing I was on my own, I glanced out the window to witness a sight which chilled me to the very bone. There was a small covered shelter by the roadside, almost covered by overgrown vegetation, and only just visible in the dim light. And within this seemingly abandoned bush shelter stood a tall, hooded figure, a sinister individual with his face covered and his considerable frame hidden underneath a long and dark robe. The mystery man remained still and silent, although I soon spotted the animal by his side, a large black dog that snarled aggressively through a snout filled with razor-sharp teeth as it glared at me with hungry and predatory eyes. only a thin glass pane separating me from him. I imagined the hound breaking loose, ascending the steps and charging down the aisle before burying his razor-sharp fangs into my soft flesh. Thankfully, the dog's master maintained control of his beast, although I was far from out of danger. I also noticed how hot and stifling it suddenly became, as an almost unbearable wave of heat hit me. Meanwhile, the bus remained parked for what seemed like an eternity, door ajar as the driver waited to see whether his passenger would get on. Now, I've since learned that the hooded figure we call our harbinger. I think it's harbinger. Will do one of these two things at this point. Either he will remain rooted to the spot until eventually the driver will say something like, "Well, not tonight then," before he closes the door and drives on. But from what I've been able to gather from both my own experience and those of my colleagues is that this is what happens most of the time. 2 times out of 3, the harbinger won't step off from the bus shelter, and that would be the end of it. But sometimes, he will step forward, marching through the mud in his heavy boots, while dragging his hellhound along on a leash. And he'll come on board the bus, prompting the driver to say, "Good evening, sir. I trust you'll have a pleasant journey." The harbinger will not answer, instead gliding down the aisle with his faithful mutt following behind him. He took his seat near the front of the bus, pulling down his hood to reveal what lies underneath. To this day, I can't fully explain what I saw in that terrifying moment. It seemed like there was only a dark void where his face should be, with 2 burning orbs instead of eyes. He had no mouth that I could see, and so by rights he shouldn't have been able to speak. And yet he did, calling out to me in a booming, godlike voice, which echoed through the hollow interior of the bus. "Come to me, mortal child," he ordered. "Come sit with me, so we may speak." As you can imagine, I was utterly terrified in this moment, so much so that I thought I might pass out. But for some reasons I can't explain, I obeyed his orders, feeling like I physically could not resist him, and as if my legs were no longer under my control. I remember looking to the other passengers as I walked down the aisle, hoping that one of them could help me, but each of the 4 kept their heads down as they muttered in unison, reciting a prayer in a language I could not understand. It became obvious that the harbinger held power over these lost souls, and they were all trapped under his spell. Perhaps they were once like us, falling victim to the phantom bus and the harbinger's godlike powers. And in any event, they offered me no assistance in that fateful moment, and I soon realized I was completely at the harbinger's mercy. I eventually took a seat and I rode directly behind him. His head turned in an unnatural way to face me, as his dog snarled aggressively in my direction, but thankfully resisted the urge to bite me in the leg. I can't really describe how the harbinger smelt, other than to say he stank of death. The fiery orbs he had instead of eyes stared right at me, and I couldn't look away no matter how much I tried. I felt like I was on fire, my soul burning under his hateful glare. In my state of abject terror, I imagined what this monster might do to me. I reckoned he could kill me with ease, but this was the least of my fears. Instead, I believed I may become like the others, another anonymous lost soul riding this damned bus for all eternity. In any event, I was powerless to do anything in that moment, other than remain frozen in my seat, waiting for him to speak. Despite his absence of eyes, somehow I could tell he was looking down on me, that he considered me with total contempt, like I was something he'd stepped in. To this day, I don't know whether he was speaking out loud or if his booming voice was only in my head. Either way, I found myself totally transfixed as he spoke his words. "I see another mere mortal has found its way into my realm," he began. I assumed he was referring to me. "I'll confess to having little time for your weak race. Nevertheless, I must respect the bravery of the odd individuals such as yourself. Not many have the courage to come to this dark place. For this reason, I will grant you safe passage, and I will answer you one question. Ask me what you will, mere mortal, and I will impart to you my infinite knowledge." Now, this is the moment I replayed over and over again in my mind over the years. I literally could have asked the harbinger anything: the winning lottery number, who killed JFK, the meaning of life. He sees and knows everything, and the possibilities are limitless. One of the guys on our forum asked the harbinger how he would die, and was told that his vices would kill him within 6 months. Well, this guy was an addict, but he laughed off the harbinger's warning and continued using. 6 months later, he was dead from an overdose. And then there was a young woman who, at the time of her encounter with the Harbinger, was stuck in an abusive and controlling relationship. She asked the entity what would happen if she stayed with her boyfriend. Well, she was told that her life would end unless she broke off the relationship. This proved to be the motivation she needed to leave him. And about a year later, the bastard was arrested for murdering another girl and ultimately sentenced to life in prison. But of course, I didn't know any of this at the time. I felt nothing but pure terror as I sat frozen in my seat, quaking in my boots as the Harbinger glared down at me with disgust. In that chilling moment, I could only think of one question to ask, which I stuttered out from my trembling lips. What are you? I swear I could hear the creature scoff with contempt before he gave his answer. My poor child, he bellowed. Alas, you humans would never fully comprehend what I am and what I represent. Nevertheless, I owe you an answer, and so I shall explain it in the simplest of terms. I am the past, present, and the future. I see all from where I stand, and yet I have sworn not to intervene in the mortal realm. He paused momentarily, turning his burning orbs towards the darkened landscape outside the window. This world you see before me is my kingdom, my domain. I offer sanctuary to those who have nowhere else to go, giving a home to those lost souls trapped between the mortal and eternal realms. Perhaps you will come here one day and become a permanent resident of my dark realm, or perhaps not. You could have acquired it after your ultimate fate, of course, but you chose not to do so. But I have answered your one permitted question and fulfilled my obligation, and now, my child, I will bid you farewell. With that, he rose from his chair and summoned his hound, gliding down the aisle as he made for the exit. I was flabbergasted. In a state of shock, I still had so many questions to ask, and I opened my mouth without thinking. Wait, I called after him, instantly regretting my decision to speak. The Harbinger turned sharply, his orb-like eyes burning ever fiercer, his hound growling as it bared its sharp teeth, pulling on his lead as it tried to get at me. When he spoke again, his tone became angry and threatening. Heed my warning, you damn fool. I've tolerated your presence in my realm thus far, but do not test my patience. I can inflict pain upon you which goes beyond your worst nightmares, and I would not hesitate to do so if you break my rules again. I felt all the blood drain from my face, and my whole body shook uncontrollably as sheer terror overcame me. Needless to say, I did not utter another word. Instead, I watched on in shock all as the Harbinger glided down the aisle, dragging his snarling hellhound with him. The driver brought the bus to a slow halt to allow the godlike creature to disembark. I began to feel pangs of relief as I thought my ordeal was nearly over, but there was one last twist to this episode. As the Harbinger stepped off the coach, my fellow passengers suddenly shot up from their seats, all simultaneously turning in my direction. To my horror, I saw how their eyes had turned jet black, and their mouths were open wide, revealing gaping black holes. It seemed like they were all trying to scream, and yet no sound was emitted. And then I saw what was lurking in the darkened woods on either side of the road. Hundreds of fiery red eyes emerging from the tree line, belonging to unholy beasts that howled like wolves in the night. Every one focused upon our bus. I screamed out in terror, fearing that the Harbinger had changed his mind and was summoning his hellish minions to tear me to pieces. The howling rapidly increased in volume, becoming so loud that I was near deafened. What happened next remains something of a blur in my memory. I recall the horrific din, and the pressure built up inside my head until I thought my skull would explode. Suddenly, there was a blind flash of light, forcing me to hide my eyes underneath my hands. A moment later, I opened my eyes again, only to discover that the beast had disappeared, as had my ghoulish fellow passengers. I was on my own inside the bus, just me and the driver, as we continued down that lonely stretch of road. I have very little recollection of the rest of that journey. I don't think it was much longer before we left the dark realm and returned to the city streets I knew and recognized. When we arrived at my home street, I could not believe it, thinking this another trick. I sat still in my seat for some time, until eventually I needed to be prompted by the driver, who called out to me saying, "You stop, my friend. Come in now, please. I can't wait here all night." Oh, thank you so much for the follow. Okay. With some trepidation, I walked down the aisle and stepped off the bus, feeling the cold fresh air against my skin as I returned to the realm of the living. I recall the driver wishing me good night and saying he would see me again before he drove away. So, that's my story, but it's not quite the end of it. You may ask why I didn't abandon my obsession with the Phantom Bus after my terrifying encounter. Well, for a long time I did, but in the end my curiosity got the better of me. I don't like the uncertainty of life and not knowing what lays before me. I used to think that's just the way it is, but now I know better. The Harbinger is out there, and he can provide the answers I need. I won't waste my opportunity a second time. For years I have chased the bus, and I've caught it a further 2 times. On both occasions, I boarded and avoided the traps set by the ghoulish passengers. And both times, I waited for the Harbinger to board, but he would not move from his shelter, and so my hopes were frustrated. It's been extremely disheartening, but I will not give up. Tonight, I will seek out the bus again, and I'll keep doing so until the Harbinger answers my call. I know the risk. One night, I may board the fan coach and never make it home, but nevertheless, I need to do this. I must know the truth, no matter what the cost. Now, if you excuse me, I have a bus to catch. Alright, that's it. That was kind of a long one.
It was good though.
Yeah. Okay, you have another one?
Yeah, I think I have time to read one
Okay.
more. So I will be reading. Okay, so most people hear the name Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and they think of Sherlock Holmes, but he actually wrote a fair amount of horror short stories, which he preferred writing over writing Holmes, and he was actually like so done with writing Holmes by the end of it that
Oh
he
yeah.
just like would get super mad whenever people would bring it up. But for my last story, I will be reading one of his horror shorts called The Horror of the Heights. Um, the idea that the extraordinary narrative, which has been called the Joyce Armstrong fragment, is an elaborate practical joke evolved by some unknown person, cursed by a perverted and sinister sense of humor, has now been abandoned to all those who have examined the matter. The macabre and imaginative of plotters would hesitate before linking this morbid fancies with the unquestioned and tragic facts which reinforce the statement. Though the assertions contained in it are amazing and even monstrous, it is nonetheless forcing itself upon the general intelligence that they are true, and that we must readjust our ideas to the new situation. This world of ours appears to be separated by a slight and precarious margin of safety from a most singular and unexpected danger. I will endeavor in this narrative, which produces the original document in its necessarily somewhat fragmentary form, to lay before the reader the whole of the facts up to date, prefacing my statement by saying that, if there be any who doubt the narrative of Joyce Armstrong, there can be no question at all as to the facts concerning Lieutenant Myrtle R.N. and Mr. Hay Connor, who undoubtedly met their end in the manner described. The Joyce Armstrong fragment was found in the field which is called Lower Haycock, lying 1 mile to the westward of the village of Witham, upon the Kent and Sussex border. It was on the 5th September last that an agricultural labourer, James Flynn, in the employment of Matthew Dodd, farmer, of the Chantry Farm, Witham, perceived a briar pipe lying near the footpath which skirts the hedge of Lower Haycock. A few paces farther on, he picked up a pair of broken binocular glasses. Finally, among some nettles in the ditch, he caught sight of a flat canvas-backed book, which proved to be a notebook, with detachable leaves, some of which had come loose, and were fluttering along the base of the hedge. These he collected, but some, including the first, were never recovered, and leave a deplorable hiatus in this all-important statement. The notebook was taken by the laborer to his master, who in turn showed it to Dr. J. H. Atherton of Hartfield. This gentleman at once recognized the need for an expert examination. The manuscript was forwarded to the Aero Club in London, where it now lies. The first 2 pages of the manuscript are missing. There is also one torn away at the end of the narrative, though none of these affect the general coherence of the story. It is conjectured that the missing opening is concerned with the record of Mr. Joyce Armstrong's qualifications as an aeronaut, which can be gathered from our other sources, and are admitted to be unsurpassed among the air pilots of England. For many years he has been looked upon as among the most daring and most intellectual of flying men, a combination which has enabled him to both invent and test several new devices, including the common gyroscopic attachment, which is known by his name. The main body of the manuscript is written neatly in ink, but the last few lines are in pencil and are so ragged as to be hardly legible, exactly, in fact, as they might be expected to appear if they were scribbled off hurriedly from one seat of a moving aeroplane. There are, it may be added, several stains, both on the last page and on the outside cover, which have been pronounced by the Home Office experts to be blood, probably human, and certainly mammalian. The fact that something closely resembling the organism of malaria was discovered in this blood, and that Joyce Armstrong is known to have suffered from intermittent fever, is a remarkable example of the new weapons which modern science has placed in the hands of our detectives. Now a word as to the personality of the author of this epoch-making statement. Joyce Armstrong, according to the few friends who really knew something of the man, was a poet and a dreamer, as well as a mechanic and an inventor. He was a man of considerable wealth, much of which he had spent in his pursuit of the aeronautical hobby. He had 4 private airplanes in his hangars in Devizes, and is said to have had no fewer than 170 ascents in the course of last year. He was a retiring man with dark moods in which he would avoid the society of his fellows. Captain Dangerfield, who knew him better than anyone, says that there were times when his eccentricity threatened to develop into something more serious. His habit of carrying a shotgun with him in his airplane was a manifestation of it. Another was the morbid effect which the fall of Lieutenant Myrtle had upon his mind. Myrtle, who was attempting the height record, felt from an altitude of something over 30,000 feet. Horrible to narrate, his head was entirely obliterated, though his body and limbs preserved their configuration. At every gathering of airmen, Joyce Armstrong, according to Dangerfield, would ask with an enigmatic smile, "And pray, is and where, pray, is Myrtle's head?" On another occasion after dinner, at the mess of the flying school on Salisbury Plain, he started a debate as to what will be the most permanent danger which airmen will have had to encounter. Having listened to successive opinions as to the air pockets, faulty construction, and overbanking, he ended by shrugging his shoulders and refusing to put forward his own views, though he gave the impression that they differed from any advance by his companions. It is worth remarking that after his own complete disappearance, it was found that his private affairs were arranged with the precision which may show that he had a strong premonition of disaster. With these essential explanations, I will now give the narrative exactly as it stands, beginning at page 3 of the blood-soaked notebook. Nevertheless, when I dined at Reims and Collesi and Gustave Raymond, I found that neither of them was aware of any particular danger of the higher layers of the atmosphere. I did not actually say what was in my thoughts, but I got so near to it that if they had any corresponding idea, they could not have failed to express it. But then they are two empty, vainglorious fellows with no thought beyond seeing their silly names in the newspaper. It is interesting to note that neither of them had ever had much beyond the 20,000-foot level. Of course, men have been higher than this, both in balloons and in the ascent of mountains. It must be well above that point that the airplanes enter the danger zone, always presuming that my premonitions are correct. Airplaning has been with us now for more than 20 years, and one might well ask, why should this peril be only revealing itself in our day? The answer is obvious. In the old days of weak engines, when 100 horsepower Gnome or Green was considered ample for every need, the flights were very restricted. Now that 300 horsepower is the rule rather than the exception, visits to the upper layers have become easier and more common. Some of us can remember how, in our youth, Garros made a worldwide reputation by attaining 19,000 feet, and it was considered a remarkable achievement to fly over the Alps. Our standard now has been immeasurably raised, and there are 20 high flights for one in former years. Many of them have been undertaken with impunity. The 30,000-foot level has been reached time and time with no discomfort beyond cold and asthma. What does this prove? A visitor might descend upon this planet 1,000 times and never see a tiger, Yet tigers exist, and if he chanced to come down into a jungle, he might be devoured. There are jungles of the upper air, and there are worse things than tigers which inhabit them. I believe in time they will map these jungles accurately out. Even at the present moment I could name two of them. One of them lies over Biarritz district of France. Another is just over my head as I write here in my house in Wiltshire. I rather think there is a third in Hamburg, Wiesbaden district. It was the disappearance of the airmen that first set me thinking. Of course, everyone said that they had fallen into the sea, but that did not satisfy me at all. First, there was Verrier in France. His machine was found near Bayonne, but they never got his body. There was the case of Baxter, also, who vanished, though his engine and some of the iron fixings were found in a wood in Leicestershire. In that case, Dr. Middleton of Amesbury, who was watching the flight with a telescope, declares that just before the clouds obscured the view, he saw the machine, which was at an enormous height, suddenly rise perpendicularly upwards in a succession of jerks, in a manner that he would have thought to be impossible. That was the last seen of Baxter. There was a correspondence in the papers, but it never led to anything. There were several other similar cases, and then there was the death of Hay Connor. With a cackle, there was about an unsolved mystery of the air, and what columns in the halfpenny papers, and yet how little was ever done to get to the bottom of the business. He came down in a tremendous volplane from an unknown height. He never got off his machine, and died in his pilot's seat. Died of what? Heart disease? Said the doctors. Rubbish. Hay Connor's heart was as sound as mine is. What did the Venables say? Venables was the only man who was at his side when he died. He said he was shivering and looked like a man who had been badly scared. Died of fright, said Venables, but could not imagine what he was frightened about. Only said one word to Venables, which sounded like monstrous. They could make nothing of that at the inquest, but I could make something of it. Monsters. That was the last word of poor Harry Hay Connor, and he did die of fright, just as Venables thought. And then there was Myrtle's head. Do you really believe, does anybody really believe, that a man's head could be driven clean into his body by the force of a fall? Well, perhaps it may be possible, but I, for one, have never believed that it was so Myrtle. And the grease upon his clothes, all slimy with grease, said somebody at the inquest. Queer that nobody got thinking after that. I did, but then I have been thinking for a good long time. I've made 3 ascents. How Dangerfield used to chaff me about my shotgun, but I have never been high enough. Now with this new light Paul Verner machine and its 175 rover, I should easily touch the 30,000 tomorrow. I'll have a shot at the record. Maybe I shall have a shot at something else as well. Of course, it's dangerous. If a fellow wants to avoid danger, he had best keep out of flying altogether and subside finally into flannel slippers and a dressing gown. But I'll visit the air jungle tomorrow, and if there's anything there I shall know. If I return, I'll find myself a bit of a celebrity. If I don't, this notebook may explain what I am trying to do, and how I lost my life in doing it. But no drivel about accidents or mysteries, if you please. I chose my Paul Verner monoplane for the job. There's nothing like a monoplane when real work is to be done. Beaumont found out in very early days. For one thing, it doesn't mind damp. It doesn't mind damp, and the weather looks as if we should be in the clouds all the time. It's a little bonny and answers my hand like a tender-mouthed horse. The engine is a 10-cylinder rotary rover, working up to 175. It has all the modern improvements, enclosed fuselage, high-curved landing skids, brakes, gyroscopic steadiers, and 3 speeds, worked by an alteration of the angle of the planes upon the Venetian blind principle. I took a shotgun with me, and a dozen cartridges filled with buckshot. You should have seen the face of Perkins, my old mechanic, when I directed him to put them in. I was dressed like an Arctic explorer, with 2 jerseys under my overalls, thick socks inside my padded boots, a storm cap with flaps, and my tout goggles. It was stifling outside the hangars, but I was going for the summit of the Himalayas and had to dress the part. Perkins knew there was something on, and implored me to take him with me. Perhaps I should if I were using the biplane, but a monoplane is a one-man show, if you want to get the last foot of life out of it. Of course, I took an oxygen bag. The man who goes for the altitude record without one will either be frozen or smothered, or both. I had a good look at the planes, the rudder bar, the elevating lever, before I got in. Everything was in order so far as I could see. Then I switched on my engine and found that she was running sweetly. When they let her go, she rose almost at once upon the lowest speed. I circled my home field once or twice just to warm her up, and then with a wave to Perkins and the others, I flattened out my planes and put her on her highest. She skimmed like a swallow downwind for 8 or 10 miles until I turned her nose up a little, and she began to climb in a great spiral for the cloud bank above me. It's all important to slowly rise and adapt yourself to the pressure as you go. It was a close, warm day for an English September, and there was the hush of heaviness of impending rain. Now and then there came sudden puffs of wind from the southwest, one of them so gusty and unexpected that it caught me napping and turned me half round for an instant. I remember the time when the gusts and whirls and air pockets used to be things of danger, before we learned to put an overmastering power into our engines. Just as I reached the cloud banks, with the altimeter marking 3,000, down came the rain. My word, how it poured! It drummed upon my wings and lashed against my face, blurring my glasses so that I could hardly see. I got down onto a low speed, for it was painful to travel against it. As I got higher, it began to hail, and I had to turn tail to it. One of my cylinders was out of action, a dirty plug, I should imagine, but I was still rising steadily with plenty of power. After a bit of the trouble had passed, whatever it was, and I heard the fall, deep-throated purr, the 10 singing as one, that's when the beauty of our modern silencers comes in. We can at last control our engines by ear. How they squeal and squeak and sob when they are in trouble. All those cries for help were wasted on the old days, when every sound was swallowed up by the monstrous racket of the machine. If only the early aviators came back to see the beauty and perfection of the mechanism which has been brought at the cost of their lives. About 9:30 I was nearing the clouds. Down below me, all blurred and shadowed with rain, lay the vast expanse of Salisbury Plain. Half a dozen flying machines were doing hack work at the 1,000-foot level, looking like little black swallows against the green background. I dare say they were wondering what I was doing up in the cloudland. Suddenly a gray curtain drew across beneath me, and wet folds of vapors were swirling round my face. It was clammily cold and miserable, but I was above the hailstorm, and that was something gained. The cloud was as dark and thick as a London fog. In my anxiety to get clear, I clocked her nose up until the automatic alarm bell rang, and I actually began to slide backwards. My soft and dripping wings made me heavier than I thought, but presently I was in a higher cloud, and soon had cleared the first layer. There was a second, opal-colored and fleecy, at a great height above me, a white unbroken ceiling above, and a dark unbroken floor below, with the monoplane laboring upwards upon a vast spiral between them. It is deadly lonely in these cloud spaces. Once a great flight of some small water birds went past me, flying very fast to the westwards. The quick whir of their wings and their musical cry were cheery to my ear. I fancy that they were teal, but I am a wretched zoologist. Now that we humans have become birds, we must really learn how our brethren we ah, we must really learn to know our brethren by sight. The wind down beneath me whirled and swayed the broad cloud plain. Once a great eddy formed in it, a whirlpool of vapor, and through it, as down a funnel, I caught sight of the distant world. A large white biplane was passing at a vast depth beneath me. I fancy it was the morning mail service betwixt Bristol and London. Then the drift swirled inwards again, and the great solitude was unbroken. Just after 10 I touched the lower edge of the upper cloud, Starum. It consisted of fine diaphanous vapor drifting swiftly from the westwards. The wind had been steadily rising all this time and was now blowing a sharp breeze, 28 an hour by my gauge. Already it was cold, though my altimeter was marked 9,000. The engines were working beautifully, and we went droning steadily upwards. The cloud bank was thicker than I had expected, but at last it thinned out into a golden mist before me, and then in an instant I had shot out from it, and there was an unclouded sky and a brilliant sun above my head. All blue and gold above, all shining silver below, one vast glimmering plain as far as my eyes could reach. It was 10:15, and the barograph needle pointed to 12,800. Up I went and up, my ears concentrated upon the deep purring of my motor. My busy eyes always with the watch, the revolution indicator, the petrol lever, and the oil pump. No wonder aviators are said to be fearless. With so many things to think of, there is no time to trouble about oneself. About this time, I noted how unreliable is the compass when above a certain height from Earth. At 15,000 feet, mine was pointing east and a point south. The sun and the wind gave me true bearings. I had hoped to reach an eternal stillness in these high altitudes, but with every 1,000 feet of ascent, the gale grew stronger. My machine groaned and trembled in every joint and rivet as she faced it, and swept away like a sheet of paper when I banked her on the turn, skimming downwind at a greater pace, perhaps, than ever mortal man was moved. Yet I had always to turn again and tack up in the wind's eye, for it was not merely a height record that I was after. By all my calculations, it was above Little Wiltshire that my air jungle lay, and all my labor might be lost if I struck the outer layers at some further point. When I reached the 19,000-foot level, which was about midday, the wind was so severe that I looked with some anxiety to the stays of my wings, expecting momentarily to see them snap or slacken. I even cast loose those parachutes behind me, and fastened its hooks into the ring of my leathern belt, so as to be ready for the worst. Now is the time when a bit of scamped work by the mechanic is paid for by the life of the aeronaut. But she held together bravely. Every cord and strut was humming and vibrating like so many harp strings, but it was glorious to see how, for all the beatings and buffeting, she was still the conqueror of nature and the mistress of the sky. There is surely something divine in man himself that he should rise so superior to the limitations which creation seemed to impose. Rise, too, by such unselfish heroic devotions as this air conquest was shown. Talk of human degeneration. When has such a story as this been written in the annals of our race? These were the thoughts in my head as I climbed the monstrous inclined plane, with the wind sometimes beating in my face and sometimes whistling behind my ears, while the cloudland beneath me fell away to such a distance that the folds and hammocks of silver had all smoothed out into one flat shining plain. But suddenly I had a horrible and unprecedented experience. I have known before what it is to be in what our neighbors have called a tourbillon, but never on such a scale as this. That huge sweeping river of wind, of which I have spoken, had, as it appears, whirlpools within it which were as monstrous as itself. Without a moment's warning, I was dragged suddenly into the heart of one. I spun round for a moment or two, with such velocity that I had lost my senses, and then fell suddenly, left wing foremost, down the vacuumed funnel in the center. I dropped like a stone, and almost nearly 1,000 feet. It was only my belt that kept me in my seat, and the shock and breathlessness left me hanging half insensible over the side of the fuselage. But I am always capable of a supreme effort. It is my one great merit as an aviator. I was conscious that the descent was slower, the whirlpool was a cone rather than a funnel, and I had come to the apex. With a terrifying wrench throwing my weight all to one side, I leveled my plane and brought her head away from the wind. In an instant I had shot out of the eddies and was skimming down the sky. Then, shaken by victorious, I turned her nose up and began, once more, my steady grind on the upward spiral. I took a large sweep to avoid the danger spot of the whirlpool, and soon I was safely above it. Just after 1 o'clock, I was 21,000 feet above the sea level. To my great joy, I had topped the gale, and with every 100 feet of ascent, the air grew stiller. On the other hand, it was very cold, and I was conscious of that peculiar nausea which goes with the refraction of the air. For the first time I unscrewed the mouth of my oxygen bag and took an occasional whiff of the glorious gas. I could feel it running like a cordial through my veins, and I was exhilarated almost to the point of drunkenness. I shouted and sang as I soared upwards into the cold, still outer world. It is very clear to me that the insensibility which came upon Glacier, and in a lesser degree Coxwell, when in 1862 they ascended in a balloon to the height of 30,000 feet, was due to the extreme speed with which a perpendicular ascent is made. Doing it at an easy gradient and accustoming oneself to the lessened barometric pressure by slow degrees, there are no such dreadful symptoms. At the same great height, I found that even without my oxygen inhaler, I could breathe without undue distress. It was bitterly cold, however, and my thermometer was at 0 Fahrenheit. At 1:30, I was nearly 7 miles above the surface of the Earth, and still ascending steadily. I found, however, that the rarefied air was giving markedly less support to my planes, and that my angle of ascent had to be considerably lowered in consequence. It was already clear that even with my lightweight and strong engine power, there was a point in front of me where I should be held. To make matters worse, one of my sparking plugs was in trouble again, and there was intermittent misfiring in the engine. My heart was heavy with the feel of failure. It was about that time that I had a most extraordinary experience. Something whizzed past me in a trail of smoke and exploded with a loud hissing sound, sending forth a cloud of steam. For the instant I could not imagine what had happened. Then I remembered that the Earth is forever being bombarded by meteor stones, and it would be hardly inhabitable were they not, in nearly every case, turned to vapor in the outer layers of the atmosphere. Here is a new danger for the high-altitude man, for 2 others passed me when I was nearing the 40,000-foot mark. I cannot doubt that at the edge of the Earth's envelope, the risk would be a very real one. My barograph meter marked 41,300 when I became aware that I could go no further. Physically, the strain was not as yet greater than I could bear, but my machine had reached its limit. The attenuated air gave no firm support to the wings, and the least tilt developed into side slip, while she seemed sluggish on her controls. Possibly, had the engine been at its best, another 1,000 feet might have been within our capacity, but it was still misfiring, and 2 out of the 10 cylinders appeared to be out of action. If I had not already reached the zone for which I was searching, then I should never see it upon this journey. But was it not possible that I had attained it? Soaring in circles like a monstrous hawk upon the 40,000-foot level, I let the monoplane guide herself, and with my Mannheim glass I made a careful observation of my surroundings. The heavens were perfectly clear. There was no indication of those dangers which I had imagined. I have said that I was soaring in circles. It struck me, suddenly, that I would do well to take a wider sweep and open up a new air tract. If the hunter entered an earth jungle, he would drive through if he wished to find his game. My reasoning had led me to believe that the air jungle which I imagined lay somewhere over Wiltshire. This should be to the south and west of me. I took my bearings from the sun, for the compass was hopeless, and no trace of the earth could be seen. Nothing but the distant silver cloud plain. However, I got my direction as best I might, and kept her head straight to the mark. I reckoned that my petrol supply would not last for more than an hour or so, but I could afford to use it to the last drop. Since a single magnificent vol plane could at any time take me to the Earth. Suddenly, I was aware of something new. The air in front of me had lost its crystal clearness. It was full of long, ragged wisps of something which I can only compare to very fine cigarette smoke. It hung about in wreaths and coils, turning and twisting slowly in the sunlight. As the monoplane shot through it, I was aware of a faint taste of oil upon my lips, and there was a greasy scum upon the woodwork of the machine. Some infinitely fine organic material appeared to be suspended in the atmosphere. There was no life here. It was inchoate and diffuse, extending for many square acres, and then fringing off into the void. No, it was not life. But might it not be the remains of life? After all, might it not be the food of life, of monstrous life, even as the humble grease of the ocean is the food for the mighty whale? The thought was in my mind when my eyes looked upwards, and I saw the most wonderful vision that ever man has seen. Can I hope to convey it to you even as I saw it myself last Thursday? Conceive a jellyfish, such as sails over our summer seas, bell-shaped and of enormous size, far larger, I should judge, than the dome of St. Paul's. It was of a light pink color, veined with delicate green, but the whole huge fabric so tenuous that it was but a fairy outline against the dark blue sky. It pulsated with a delicate and regular rhythm. From it there depended 2 long, drooping green tentacles, which swayed slowly backwards and forwards. This gorgeous vision passed gently with noiseless dignity over my head, as light and fragile as a soap bubble, and drifted upon its stately way. I had half turned my monoplane, that I might look after this beautiful creature, when, In a moment, I found myself amidst a perfect fleet of them, of all sizes, but none so large as the first. Some were quite small, but the majority was about as big as an average balloon, and with much the same curvature at the top. There was in them a delicacy of texture and coloring which reminded me of the finest Venetian glass. Pale shades of pink and green were the prevailing tints, but all had a lovely iridescence where the sun shimmered through their dainty forms. Some hundreds of them drifted past me, a wonderful fairy squadron of strange unknown argoises of the sky, creatures whose forms and substances were attuned to these pure heights that one could not conceive anything so delicate within actual sight or sound of earth. But soon my attention was drawn to a new phenomenon, the serpents of the outer air. These were long. Oops, hang on 1 second.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Uh. I lost my place a bit. Oh, here we go. But soon my attention was drawn to a new phenomenon, the serpents of the outer air. These were long, thin, fantastic coils of vapor-like material which turned and twisted with great speed, flying round and round at such a pace that the eyes could hardly follow them. Some of these ghost-like creatures were 20 or 30 feet long, but it was difficult to tell their girth, for their outline was so hazy that it seemed to fade away into the air around them. These air snakes were of a very light gray or smoke color, with some darker lines within, which gave the impression of a definite organism. One of them whisked past my very face, and I was conscious of a cold, clammy contact. But their composition was so unsubstantial that I could not connect them with any thought of physical danger, any more than the beautiful bell-like creatures which had preceded them. There was no more solidarity in their frames than the floating spume of a broken wave, but a more terrible experience was in store for me. Floating downwards from a great height, there came a purplish patch of vapor, small as I saw it at first, but rapidly enlarging as it approached me, until it appeared to be hundreds of square feet in size. Though fashioned of some transparent jelly-like substance, it was nonetheless of much more definite outline and solid consistence than anything which I had seen before. There were more traces, too, of a physical organization, especially two vast, shadowy, circular pallets upon either side, which many have been eyes, and a perfectly solid white projection between them, which was as curved and cruel as the beak of a vulture. The whole aspect of this monster was formidable and threatening, and it kept changing its color from a very light mauve to a dark angry purple, so thick that it cast a shadow as it drifted between my monoplane and the sun. On the upper curve of its huge body there were three great projections, which I can only describe as enormous bubbles, and I was convinced as I looked at them that they were charged with some extremely light gas, which served to buoy up the misshapen and semi-solid mass in the refined area. The creature moved swiftly along, keeping pace easily with the monoplane, and for 20 miles or more it formed my horrible escort, hovering over me like a bird of prey which is waiting to pounce. Its method of progression, done so swiftly that it was not easy to follow, was to throw out a long, gluttonous streamer in front of it, which in turn seemed to draw forward the rest of the writhing body. So elastic and gelatinous was it that never for 2 successive minutes was it the same shape, and yet each change it made it more threatening and loathsome than the last. I knew that it meant mischief. Every purple flush of its hideous body told me so. The vague, goggling eyes which were turned upon me were cold and merciless in their viscid hatred. I dipped the nose of my monoplane downwards to escape it. As I did so, a quick flash there shot out a long tentacle from its mass of floating blubber, and it fell as light and sinuous as a whiplash across the front of my machine. There was a loud hiss as it lay for a moment across the hot engine, and it whisked itself into the air again. While the huge flat body drew itself together as if in sudden pain, I dipped to a vol peak, but again a tentacle fell over the monoplane and was shorn off by the propeller as easily as it might have cut through the smoke wreath. A long, gliding, sticky, serpent-like coil came from behind me and caught me around the waist, dragging me out of the fuselage. I tore at it, my fingers sinking into the smooth, glue-like surface. and for an instant I disengaged myself, but only to be caught round the boot by another coil, which gave me a jerk that tilted me almost onto my back. As I fell over, I blazed off both barrels of my gun, though indeed it was like attacking an elephant with a pea shooter to imagine that any human weapon could cripple that mighty bulk, and yet I aimed better than I knew, for, with a loud report, one of the great blisters upon the creature's back exploded with the puncture of the buckshot. It was very clear that my conjecture was right, and that these vast clear bladders were distended with some lifting gas, for in an instant the huge cloud-like body turned sideways, writhing desperately to find its balance, while the white beak snapped and gaped in horrible fury. But already I had shot away on the steepest glide that I dared to attempt, my engine still full on, the flying propeller and the force of gravity shooting me downwards like an airlight. From behind me I saw a dull purplish smudge growing swiftly smaller and merging into the blue sky behind it. I was safe out of the deadly jungle of the outer air. Once out of danger, I throttled my engine, for nothing tears a machine to pieces quicker than running on full power from a height. It was a glorious spiral volplane from nearly 8 miles of altitude, first to the level of the silver cloud bank, then to the storm cloud beneath it, and finally, in beating rain, to the surface of the earth. I saw the Bristol Channel beneath me as I broke from the clouds, but, having still some petrol in my tank, I got 20 miles inland before I found myself stranded in a field half a mile from the village of Ashcombe. There I got 3 tins of petrol from a passing motor car, and at 10 minutes past 6 that evening, I alighted gently in my own home meadow at Devizes, after such a journey as no mortal upon earth has ever taken and lived to tell the tale. I have seen the beauty, and I have seen the horror of the heights, and great beauty or greater horror than is not within the ken of men. And now it is my plan to go once again before I give the results to the world. My reasons for this is that I must surely have something to show by way of proof before I say such a tale before my fellow men. It is true that others will soon follow and will confirm what I have said, and yet I should wish to carry conviction from the first. These lovely iridescent bubbles of the air should not be hard to capture. They drift slowly upon their way, and the swift monoplane could intercept their leisurely course. It is likely enough that they would dissolve in the heavier layers of the atmosphere, and that some small heap of amorous jelly might be all I should bring to the earth with me, and yet something there would surely be by which I could substantiate my story. Yes, I will go, even if I run a risk by doing so. These purple horrors would not be the numerous. It is probable that I shall not see one. If I do, I shall dive at once. At worst, there is always the gunshot and my knowledge of. Here, a page of the manuscript is unfortunately missing. On the next page is written, in large, straggling writing, 43,000 feet. I shall never see earth again. They are beneath me, 3 of them. God help me, it is a dreadful death to die. Such, in its eternity, is the Joyce Armstrong statement. Of the man, nothing has been seen since. Pieces of his shattered monoplane have been picked up in the preserves of Mr. Bud Lushington, upon the borders of Kent and Sussex, within a few miles of the spot where the notebook was discovered. If the unfortunate aviator's theory is correct that this air jungle, as he called it, existed only over the southwest of England, then it would seem that he has fled from it all at full speed of his monoplane, but had been overtaken and devoured by these horrible creatures at some spot in the outer atmosphere above the place where the Grimm relics were found. The picture of the monoplane skimming down the sky, with the nameless terrors flying as swiftly beneath it and cutting it off always from the earth, while they gradually closed in upon their victim, is one upon which a man who valued his sanity would prefer not to dwell. There are many, as I am aware, who still jeer at the facts which I have here set down, but even they must admit that Joyce Armstrong has disappeared, and I would commend to them his own words. This notebook may explain what I am trying to do, and how I lost my life in doing it, but no drivel about accidents or mysteries, if you please. Yeah, that is the horror of the heights.
I'm so like surprised that he did make like a horror like short story.
He actually wrote like 2 or 3 collections of short horror stories. Yeah.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
I like that one because it's like creatures like in the skies. You don't really think of that.
Yeah. It's like It's in the realm of cosmic horror, which is
Yeah.
a genre that kind of died out, like, since, or it didn't so much die out as, like, modern cosmic horror is basically just remembered via Lovecraft, but it's fun.
Okay, yeah. Okay, you said that was like your last story for now?
Yeah. I'll stick around if you want to read another one, but I don't think I can read anymore.
That's okay. You know, it's like you read it a lot and then you kind of like, for me at least, I get like just my eyes start to close just a little bit. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, I guess I'll just read this one. I believe it's a short one. Yeah, it might be a little bit long if I, oh wait. Okay, yeah, it's kind of long. Let's see if there's anything that's a little bit shorter. Nah, I'll read this one. It's fine. Alright. Yeah, so this was another creepypasta. It's called The Chimney Man, written by Phantom 13. Okay. My dad built his dream cabin in the southern Ozarks back in 1991, a reward to himself for achieving early retirement. The damn thing took nearly a year to build, but with the county having to actually build the road to my family's property at the top of a small mountain. I was 14 at the time, and yes, we were wealthy, but the cabin didn't reflect that. It was simple. Unlike most of the monstrosities you see in places like Aspen these days, and at that age, I was ruined into thinking that I'd rather live in the city, where I'd have an easier time being spoiled rotten. I despised being there to say the least. We moved into cabin in midwinter, a couple of weeks before Christmas. Everyone was excited, except me, to be moving in to enjoy Christmas morning in front of the big fireplace my dad gloated over. Amelia, my little sister, was 6 at the time, and she was elated that Santa would have such an easy entry point. Our old house didn't even have a chimney. Looking back, the first day was an omen, but there was no way we could have known. We pulled up to the cabin around noon on December 12th. My sister playing Kirby's Dream Land on her Game Boy, and me listening to Nirvana on my Walkman. Again, I was not excited. Mom and Dad were chipper as usual, and was grating on my nerves. My dad wouldn't shut up about how he had the fireplace hooked into the central system, so that all the heat would be distributed evenly throughout the house. We all began unloading what we had in the back of the Bronco, everything else having been moved in, at great expense. A few days before, my father's annoyingly happy face drooped into a mild frown when he shouldered open the front door. Looks like the movers didn't care too much about the new carpet, he said sarcastically. There in the living room, starting where the wood floors ended from the foyer, was a trail of footprints in the carpet, apparently made with soot, leading from just in front of the entry to the fireplace, the back door. I snorted at my father's comment, which earned me a side eye for the ages from my mom. We sat down what we were carrying in our respective rooms, and of course, I was tasked with cleaning up the mess while my dad called the moving company to complain. While I was scrubbing and fuming, it occurred to me that if the footprints were in fact soot, then it would be hard to explain why the fireplace had already been used in our brand new cabin. At the time, I assumed that there had to have been a test run by the builder to ensure everything was in working order. It took me about an hour to bring the carpet to my parents' satisfaction, and then I promptly went to my new room to continue wallowing in my teenage angst. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched in the shower, that someone was standing just on the other side of the curtain. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling worsened when I closed my eyes to wash my hair and face. Finally, I pulled back the curtain, feeling foolish for being such a wimp. Of course, I found nothing unusual. I wrote my paranoia off as just being pissed off from the move, and didn't think much of it. I didn't have another strange encounter for several days, but about a week after I got to shower, stock revive, Amelia let my mom and I know about her new friend at the breakfast table. "How did everyone sleep last night?" my mother asked, trying to get through my solemn disdain. "Fine," I replied, through a mouthful of scrambled eggs. "I played with the man behind the curtains," Amelia exclaimed. I told him that he would be in big trouble if he kept getting the rug dirty. "Oh, that's wonderful, honey," my mom said. "I'm glad you've made a friend. Tell them I said thank you for not getting any more stains on the carpet." It made me bitter listening to my mom placate my sister while I was in social isolation. Mom just kept sipping her coffee and reading the newspaper that Dad paid extra attention to have delivered out that far in the wilderness. There was no fear in my sister's voice. Neither of us even remotely considered the possibility that her new friend was anything more than imaginary. Later that day, I was taking some folded laundry to my sister's room. I put it in her drawer, turned to walk out, and I saw them, 2 charcoal shoe prints under the window curtain, as if someone had been hiding there. Initially, I disregarded them as leftover from the moving crew, just like the others. I ignored them. Let Mom clean them up, I thought to myself, but it kept nagging at me. I'd helped Amelia get settled into her room, and I would have noticed them. They weren't there before. I still don't know why, but I never told my parents about them. I ultimately did go back to clean them up, and carried on. Amelia surely had made them somehow as part of her relationship with her new friend. That night, December 23rd, I had trouble sleeping. The feeling that I was being watched had returned shortly after the discovery in Amelia's room, and I hadn't been able to shake it. I hadn't admitted it to myself yet, but a microscopic part of my imagination had begun to suspect something amiss. At 14, I still hadn't quite squashed my fear of ghosts. I kept looking across the room into the back of my open closet, half expecting someone to be standing there, their shoes covered in black dust. I felt shame for being scared, but finally I drifted off sometime around midnight. I still can't remember what woke me. I just know that my sheets were damp with sweat when I came to. I felt again that I was being watched, and I began scanning the dark room through my blurry, just waking up vision. I followed my curtains down to the floor and saw them, soiled black feet poking out from beneath them. I jumped a bit, then rubbed my eyes and looked back. There was no shoes, but the curtain was moving ever so slightly. I looked at my closet door, which had been shut without a sound. Cowering, I pulled the blankets over my head, knowing that if I pulled them down, something would be there, sitting at the end of my bed. After a while, I tried to sleep, but couldn't. Of course, I was blamed the next day for the dirty tracks to and from my room. They began and ended in front of our fireplace, just like the first time, but they clearly led to my bedroom closet and back. My parents gave me a big speech about how I needed to accept my new circumstances and start treating everyone and everything with a lot more respect. I didn't have the energy to fight with them. All I could think about were the footprints and the thing that spent the night with me. I just rolled my eyes, accepted my punishment, cleaned up the prints, and then no Walkman until I straightened up. It wasn't like they'd believe me, so why say anything? I scrubbed the carpets that day in a daze, remembering what Amelia had said a few days before at breakfast. My thoughts raced for rational explanations. But I kept arriving at this strange amalgamation of ghosts and Santa Claus. Despite everything going on, I still had Christmas morning on my mind, just like everyone that age. Yet, by the time I had finished cleaning, I had resigned myself to try and sort out what was going on. I would start with my sister. That night, after an almost silent dinner, I went to Amelia's room to do some gentle prying. As I rounded the door frame, I found her staring up at the ceiling vent. The floor around her bed was covered in that morning's newspaper. "What's all this for?" I asked, trying to remain calm despite already knowing the answer. "For the man that likes to hide in the curtains," she almost whispered. I told him I would keep the floor clean. He doesn't like leaving tracks because he's afraid I'll have to leave if Mommy and Daddy find out about him. He said that if I did that for him, he'd take me to visit his house. He says that there are a lot of other kids there I could play with. All of this she said as a matter of fact, as if she and the man had been friends for years, and I should know these things. I almost lost what little cool I had left, my eyes widening and my mouth opening to scorn her for being so naive, but I caught myself, resolving to try and solve the mystery on my own, without shaming a 6-year-old. As appalling as it was, I decided to use my sister as bait to catch whoever, whatever, was leaving the damn prints in the carpet, and possibly planning a kidnapping. "Okay," I began. "Just make sure you tell Mom and Dad that all the newspaper is for watercolors or something. That way they don't get suspicious. I will, she replied enthusiastically. Thank God Amelia was 6 and didn't know a lot of explanation. I left her room with terrified curiosity, wondering what Christmas Eve would have in store. For what seemed to be the 100th time, I lay in bed, unable to fall asleep. I watched my clock tick for seconds, minutes, hours. I knew that should anything actually arrive in Amelia's room, I'd hear the crumpling of paper. I also knew that Amelia would be awake, desperate not only for her new friend to come out, but also for the sound of sleigh bells. Just as I began to drift, sometime around 1 in the morning, I heard it, the sound of rustling newspaper. I hosted myself out of the sleeping awake twilight I was in and ejected myself from bed, too stricken with urgency to consider being quiet. I landed on my floor with a thud, and immediately I heard my sister whine from across the hall. "Please don't go, no, come back," I cried. I raced out of my bedroom, older sibling protective instincts at full tilt, and into the hallway just in time to be stopped in my tracks. A tall, willowy silhouette stood at the living room end of the hallway. The thing, man, stood so tall that it stooped, bending at the ceiling, using its long, spindly arms to brace against the walls. The lunar glow coming in through the skylight was just enough to show me that it was a uniformly pale, almost paper white, and without clothes. I stared up at what I thought should be its face. Its lack of features slightly disorienting. It had two indentations where there should have been eyes, as if there once were sockets, but skin had been stretched over them. I thought I saw a small slit that must have been a mouth. I began to notice that its body seemed thin, almost two-dimensional, and then it moved. I gasped, as it moved with unnatural motion, as if its joints were the result of being creased and folded into a box, using its abnormally gamely arms to balance on the floor, and lurched to the living room. For a moment, I considered just going back to my room, but I'd come too far. I summoned what little courage I had and edged towards the living room, peeking around the corner of the hallway's end. In the moonlight, I followed a trail of grayish footprints with my eyes up to the fireplace, where the twin doors into the hearth stood open. I caught a glimpse of a limb being retracted into the chimney. I just stared, not daring to move, not daring to breathe too loudly or deeply, lest it come back for me. Amelia broke me from the trance. "Don't hurt him," she whispered meekly from behind me. I spun around startled, my heart thumping in my chest. We locked eyes for a moment, me not believing what I'd seen, Amelia not comprehending why I seemed so disheveled. Finally, I found words. "Go back to bed, Amelia," I stammered. "No, he won't hurt you. He won't." She started to tear up. I kept finding myself unable to speak, as if the thing in our fireplace had stolen my vocabulary. I just kept standing there, watching Amelia weep as if I was taking away a new puppy. In my head, I was sprinting, trying to weigh out the options. I took Amelia by the hand and went to the hallway closet for my dad's Meg light. I crept back to the fireplace, Amelia mercifully not fighting my grip. I sat for a moment. "Amelia, if anything happens when I look up the chimney, you run and wake up Mom and Dad. Do you understand?" Amelia nodded. I took a deep breath and I leaned back into the fireplace as I turned on the flashlight and looked up. A sheet white face met mine, the creature hanging upside down and craning its neck to face me. There were no eyes, but a round black hole for a mouth, gaping to reveal a seemingly bottomless oblivion. I scrambled out of the hearth and collapsed there on the floor, waiting for it to come out after me as my chest heaved. But it never did. At some point, I got up, ignoring my sister's questions and pleading, as a numb, thoughtless state came over me. I took the fireplace matches, doused the carpet in lighter fluid from a kitchen cabinet, and set the carpet ablaze. That place be damned. Amelia and I never told our parents what happened, and I can't remember much of what happened in the immediate aftermath. After hundreds of hours of therapy, the only solid thing I can retrieve after looking up the chimney that horrifying Christmas morning is sitting out in the snow with my family, holding my knees to my chest as we waited for the fire department from a distant town. Amelia wailing about her friend burning alive. By the time the fire trucks got there, the cabin had burned to the ground. None of the firemen even bothered turning on their hoses. The therapists tell my parents that I've got repressed memories as a result of being so miserably sequestered from society at time, when social development is paramount. What a bunch of BS. Amelia wouldn't talk to me for a long time because from her perspective, I'd murdered her friend. A few years later, she began to comprehend. We talked, we reconciled, and we agreed never to speak of it. The fire was attributed to a likely electrical problem within the system that distributed to the heat from the fireplace. I guess small-town forensic scientists don't know what accelerants look like. My parents never quite understood why Amelia was convinced that I had caused the fire when the fire department said otherwise. It strained us for a while, but eventually I guess they just let it go as Amelia's vivid imagination. The day after, we were allowed to sift through the smoldering rubble to try and salvage anything we could. All that we found were a set of footprints that led into the woods and didn't return to the house. We followed them, but eventually they disappeared abruptly. My parents don't know who they could have possibly belonged to, but Amelia and I do. And that's it. End of that one.
I like it.
Yeah, I think a lot of mine are all like creatures.
Yeah, it was fun.
Okay, let's see. Oh, okay, it's about like been streaming for like 2 hours, about almost 3. I think that's a good time actually. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's probably a good time to end it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was really fun reading stories with you, Grimm.
It was fun joining you. Thank you for having
Yeah.
me.
Oh, let me see. Hold on. Let me see if I can get a shout out for your channel.
Oh, thank you.
Let's make sure you got it right. Oh no, I think I messed up. Take us here. It's like I don't remember the commands. Did that work? That did not work. Okay, let me fix that.
That's okay. That is my Twitch at least. Yeah, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Great stories. I know. There was like one story that my sister wanted me was suggesting about like bubble tea, and I was like, I just read it briefly. I'm like, that's actually kind of a little bit terrifying.
Yeah. You'll have to send it to me via DM so I can
Yes.
read it.
It's just, yeah, it's interesting. Okay, I'll send you it. Yeah, thanks so much for coming, everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, but let's see. I'll see if I can stream tomorrow. But if not, I might be a little bit busy. But I'll have to figure out what time. I think Hina. And I think like some of the music was a little bit like it wasn't quite matching some of like the mood, but it's okay. Ah yes, cosmic horror.
Yep. I do enjoy cosmic horror.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, gotta make sure it was like some of it was a little bit like maybe too intense, but it was okay. But yeah, so yeah, definitely, check out Grimm. They will. I think you said you're mostly be doing a lot of reading streams.
Yeah, so I haven't officially started streaming yet, because I just got a new computer set up, but I will be starting sometime next month, and I will be doing some art streams and some horror game streams, but mostly storytelling streams.
That's exciting.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
Oh, sister just gave like a redeem for hydrate. Yes, we definitely need it. I think the drink, like my coffee now tastes like I think because it had ice in it a little bit, so now it's just watered down. Okay. Alright, let's see. So we got a good amount. Yeah, I think we can. Usually, I was like, I accidentally forget to raid someone, so we can raid someone. Let's see what we got here. I think. Hold on. But yeah, Graham, we got plans for Halloween?
Uh, I haven't really decided what I'm doing
Oh.
yet. I'm probably gonna hang out with friends, but I just haven't really thought about it this year. What about you?
Uh, I'll probably do what I always do every year: pass out candy. That's it.
Yeah,
I've been like the designated like candy, yeah, just handing out candy every year. It used to be like our cousin that lived with us, but now that she moved away, it's been me.
yeah,
Yeah, but it's okay. I always like enjoy it and like uh just seeing like kids like costumes and stuff. Like, oh wow.
yeah.
All right. Okay. Yes, we can. I found out who we can raid. We can raid Draku. He's been playing. I think he's playing Omori. That's a good game actually. I haven't finished it. Okay. Hold on. Let me see. Let me get it set up though. I know how to do this. Okay, I think I got it. Yeah. Yes. Okay, I got it. All right, but yeah, thanks again for joining me, and yeah, thanks everyone for joining, and chilling, listening to us. But yeah, everyone have like a safe. If you're doing anything for Halloween, uh, you know, stay safe out there, and yeah, take care. Bye bye.